The light comes early in the north woods, filtering through branches that have stood for longer than anyone can remember. And there is something about the way it falls, soft and golden, across the bark of white pine and hemlock, that makes time feel different, slower, as if the forest itself is breathing at a pace all its own. I find myself standing at the edge of something vast, not just in space, but in story, where the trees rise like cathedral columns, their trunks so wide that 3 men with arms outstretched could barely encircle them. And in the silence between birdsong, I can almost hear the echo of axes, the creak of leather harnesses, the low voices of men who made their living in these towering groves. This is the world of the lumberjack, though that word feels too small, too simple for what it really meant to work in the great timber stands of North America during those decades when the country was being built, board by board, from the forests of Michigan and Wisconsin, from the pine woods of Minnesota, from the Douglas fir stands of the Pacific Northwest, and the endless spruce forests that stretched across the northern reaches. The era I'm thinking of now, the one that unfolds in my mind like an old photograph slowly developing, spans roughly from the 1870s through the 1920s, though the exact boundaries are soft, like fog at the edge of a clearing, because industries don't begin and end with the turning of calendar pages. They rise like sap in springtime and fade like autumn color, gradually, inevitably. There's something almost mythic about this period, the peak years of the logging camps, when tens of thousands of men disappeared into the wilderness each autumn, when the fall colors began to turn and didn't emerge again until the spring thaw, when the rivers ran high and fast enough to carry their winter's work down to the mills, and it's easy to romanticize it, to picture rugged individuals conquering nature with nothing but muscle and steel. But the truth, as always, is more complex, more human, more worth understanding. The scale of it all is what strikes me first. The sheer magnitude of what was undertaken, entire forests, some of which had been growing since before European contact, were surveyed, claimed, cut, and floated away, transformed from living ecosystems into the raw material of expansion, the lumber that built Chicago after the Great Fire, the timbers that shored up mine shafts in the Rockies, the boards that became farmhouses on the prairie, schoolhouses in young towns, boardwalks in boom cities. And yet, for all that scale, for all that industrial ambition, the work itself was done by hand, by men using tools that would have been recognizable to woodsmen centuries before, axes with carefully shaped handles, cross-cut saws that sang their metallic song through the winter air, and later, as the industry grew, more specialized equipment, peavies and cant hooks for rolling logs, and eventually the first steam-powered machines that hissed and clanked at the landing sites. I think about the camps themselves, rough clusters of buildings set deep in the forest, far from any town, reachable only by logging road or frozen river, and in my mind's eye I can see the bunkhouses, long and low, with bunks stacked too high along the walls, a single wood stove in the center throwing off waves of heat, drying the wool socks and leather boots that hung on lines overhead, the air thick with the smell of smoke and sweat and damp wool, and men too tired to do much more than eat and collapse into their blankets. There's a rhythm to this world, a seasonal pulse that governed everything, and understanding that rhythm is like finding the key to a piece of music because logging was never a year-round enterprise in these northern forests. It was a winter industry, when the ground froze hard enough to support the weight of loaded sleighs, when horses could haul massive logs across snow and ice, when men could work without the torment of black flies and mosquitoes, and when the cold itself became a tool, hardening the roads, preserving the food, keeping the rivers solid until the time came to break them open. So the story I'm following, the one that winds through these tall trees and across frozen lakes, begins in autumn, when the leaves turn and the air grows sharp, when the call goes out for men to fill the camps, and it stretches through the long darkness of winter, through the hard labor of felling and hauling, through the communal life of the bunkhouse and the cook shack, and culminates in spring, when the ice goes out and the river drives begin, and thousands upon thousands of logs go tumbling downstream, a wild and dangerous finale to months of careful work. The story doesn't begin with the great camps of the 1890s, or even with the first commercial sawmills that appeared along the eastern seaboard in colonial times. It begins much earlier, in the old growth forests themselves, in the centuries of undisturbed growth that created stands of timber unlike anything we can easily imagine today. When European settlers first arrived on the Atlantic coast, they encountered forests that seemed limitless, trees of such size and quality that a single white pine could yield masts tall enough and strong enough for the largest naval vessels, and the British Crown, recognizing the strategic value of this resource, began marking the finest specimens with the King's broad arrow, claiming them for the Royal Navy, reserving them against the needs of empire. This was logging's first incarnation in North America, selective, strategic, focused on the most valuable trees for shipbuilding, and the men who did this work were not yet called lumberjacks. They were simply woodsmen, working in small crews, often in summer when the rivers were navigable, felling giants with axes alone, since the cross-cut saw had not yet come into common use, and the work was slow, deliberate, almost intimate in its scale. The pine forests of New England were the first to feel the systematic bite of the axe, particularly in Maine, where rivers like the Penobscot and the Kennebec became highways for timber, their currents carrying logs to the coastal mills, and small logging operations began to establish patterns that would later be replicated across the continent. The use of river systems for transport, the seasonal nature of the work, the development of specialized tools and techniques. By the early 1800s, the industry was growing, driven by the needs of a young nation building itself up from raw materials, and the technology was evolving too. The crosscut saw, sometimes called a misery whip for the brutal nature of its use, began to replace the axe as the primary felling tool, allowing two men to bring down trees that would have taken a single axeman days to fell. And the lumber camp, as a distinct institution, began to take shape. These early camps were modest affairs, a few rough shelters thrown up near the cutting site, occupied by perhaps a dozen men. Local farmers, often, working the woods during the agricultural off-season to earn cash money, and there was still a connection to settled life, to towns and families that would fade as the industry pushed deeper into the wilderness, farther from the comforts of civilization. But it was the opening of the Great Lakes region, the vast forests of Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, that transformed logging from a regional industry into something approaching a national obsession, something that would shape the very character of American expansion, because here were forests that dwarfed even the great pine stands of New England, white pines stretching as far as anyone could see, mixed with hardwoods, with hemlock and spruce, timber enough, it seemed to last forever. The timing was significant. This was the 1840s and 50s, a period of explosive growth, railroads pushing westward, cities rising seemingly overnight, the California gold rush creating boom towns that needed to be built from timber and boards, and the Great Lakes forests were perfectly positioned, accessible by water, by the natural highway of lakes and rivers that connected them to Chicago, to Buffalo, to all the growing markets of the interior. The men who recognized this opportunity, the lumber barons who had become wealthy beyond measure, began acquiring timber rights on an enormous scale, buying land from the federal government at $1.25 an acre, sometimes less. And what they were buying was not just land, but the trees themselves, white pine that had been growing for 200 years or more, resources that had accumulated over centuries, now to be liquidated in decades. And so the camps grew larger, more permanent, more organized. By the 1860s and 70s, a major logging camp might house 50 men, 100 men, eventually even more, and these were no longer farmers earning side money. These were professional woodsmen, men who followed the timber, moving from Michigan to Wisconsin, from Wisconsin to Minnesota, living most of their lives in the deep woods, in a world governed by its own rules and rhythms. The work itself was being refined into something like a science, or perhaps an art, because there was a right way and a wrong way to do everything in the woods, and the difference could mean the difference between profit and loss, between safety and catastrophe. The sawyers learned to read a tree before they cut it, to understand the lean, the weight distribution, the internal tensions that could cause a trunk to split or kick back when the saw bit deep. They developed a vocabulary for their work, terms that sound almost like poetry when you hear them now, the undercut and the back cut, the holding wood that acted like a hinge, the widowmaker, that terrible phrase for a broken branch caught high in the canopy, waiting to fall on an unwary man below, and every term carried weight, carried the accumulated wisdom of men who had learned these lessons the hard way. The felling itself followed a pattern that became ritualized through repetition. The sawyers would approach a marked tree, one man on either end of the long cross-cut saw, and they would study it, walk around it, look up into its crown to see which way it wanted to fall, because a good sawyer worked with the tree, not against it, used its own weight and lean to guide it down into a clear space where it wouldn't shatter on impact, wouldn't hang up in the branches of its neighbors. Then came the undercut, a wedge chopped out of the side facing the intended direction of fall, and this had to be precise, the angle just right, the depth calculated to leave enough holding wood, and the two men would work in rhythm, their axe blows alternating, chips flying, the sharp crack of steel on wood echoing through the forest. After the undercut came the back cut, started on the opposite side, slightly higher than the deepest part of the undercut, and this was saw work, the long blades sliding back and forth, the men finding their rhythm, pushing and pulling, the teeth biting steadily deeper. And there was an art to it, keeping the saw level, maintaining the right amount of pressure, listening to the sound of the blade, which would change as it moved through the wood, through heartwood and sapwood, through the living core of a tree that might have germinated before Columbus sailed. And then, when the saw had bitten deep enough, there would come a moment of tension, a slight movement in the crown far above, a creaking sound like a door opening, and the sawyers would pull their blade free and step back, calling out timber, their voices ringing through the woods as warning, and the tree would begin its fall, slowly at first, then gathering speed, the crown sweeping down through the air, branches snapping until the moment of impact. A crash that shook the ground, that sent snow showering from nearby trees, that marked the end of 2 centuries of growth in a handful of seconds. But felling was only the beginning. The tree had to be limbed. The branches removed with swift axe work had to be bucked, cut into logs of manageable length, 16 feet, 20 feet, whatever the market demanded and the transportation could handle. And this, too, required skill, required understanding of where the log would be used, how it would be milled, what it was worth. And then came the question of moving it, of getting these massive logs, some weighing several tons, from where they fell to the landing site where they would wait for transport. And in the early days, this was done with horses or oxen, powerful draft animals that could drag a log chained behind them, but only if the ground was right, frozen hard, or smoothed by snow. And this is why winter became the season of logging in the northern forests. The development of the ice road was a turning point, an innovation that sounds simple but was actually quite sophisticated, because these weren't just paths through the snow. They were carefully engineered roadways, graded and cleared during the autumn, then iced throughout the winter by water tanks mounted on sleighs. Men would make runs at night when the temperature dropped lowest, spraying water that would freeze into a smooth, hard surface, a highway of ice that could support enormous loads. On these ice roads, the big sleighs would run, massive sleds piled high with logs, drawn by teams of horses, 2 horses, 4 horses, sometimes 6 or even 8 for the heaviest loads. And the sleighs themselves were marvels of practical engineering. The runners curved and shod with iron, the bunks where the logs rested carefully positioned to distribute the weight. Everything designed to make the best use of winter's temporary infrastructure. At the landing, the logs would be piled, stacked in enormous decks, marked with the company's stamp, a unique pattern of axe marks or paint that would identify ownership even after the logs were mixed with others in the river drive. And all winter long the piles would grow, the accumulated harvest of months of labor, waiting for the ice to break and the rivers to rise. The camps that supported this work were becoming small cities unto themselves, rough and temporary perhaps, but organized with surprising sophistication. There was a hierarchy, a structure, the camp boss who oversaw everything, the walking boss who supervised the cutting crews in the woods, the scaler who measured and tallied the harvest, the barn boss who cared for the horses, the cookie who assisted the all-important camp cook. And there were rules, unwritten but universally understood. No drinking in camp, no fighting, no stealing. Violations could mean immediate dismissal, a long walk back to civilization in the middle of winter. And there was a code, too, a sense of collective responsibility, because in the deep woods, far from doctors or law, men depended on each other absolutely. A broken leg could mean death if your bunkmates didn't care for you. A fire in the bunkhouse could kill everyone if someone didn't raise the alarm. The rhythm of the day was set by the cook's triangle, ringing out in the darkness of a winter morning, 4 o'clock, 4:30, calling men from their bunks to the cookhouse where breakfast waited. Enormous quantities of food, flapjacks and salt pork and beans, strong coffee and molasses, enough calories to fuel 12 or 14 hours of the hardest physical labor imaginable, and the men would eat in silence. That was the rule in many camps. No talking at meals, just the sound of forks on tin plates, of coffee being poured, of men fueling themselves for the day ahead. Then out into the cold, into darkness that was absolute, except for the lanterns carried by the walking boss, the men moving in a column along the tote road, their breath forming clouds in air so cold it burned the lungs, temperatures that could drop to 20 below, 30 below, even 40 below zero on the worst nights, and yet the work had to continue, because winter was short and the contract had to be filled. The forest in winter darkness has a quality unlike anything else, a silence so deep it seems to have weight, broken only by the crunch of boots on snow, the creak of leather, the occasional crack of a tree splitting in the cold. And as the men spread out to their assigned cutting areas, each team knowing their section, their trees, the forest would begin to wake with the sound of axes and saws, a rhythm that would continue until the light failed again in mid-afternoon. There was a mathematics to it all, a calculation that governed every decision. The cruisers had been through months before, walking the forest with their calipers and notebooks, measuring diameter at breast height, estimating board feet, marking trees with paint or axe blazes, and their surveys determined everything: where the camps would be placed, how many men would be needed, what the winter's cut should yield in lumber. A good white pine, straight and clear, might contain 1,000 board feet, enough lumber to frame a modest house, and a single cutting crew, 2 sawyers and their support team, might fell and process 8 to 10 such trees in a day, perhaps more if conditions were perfect, if the snow wasn't too deep, if the trees fell clean, if nothing went wrong, but something always went wrong. Saws would bind in the cut, trees would hang up in their neighbors' branches, equipment would break in the cold. The swampers followed behind the felling crews, clearing paths, building rough corduroy roads of small logs laid crosswise, creating the infrastructure that would allow the skidding teams to reach the felled timber. And this was hard work too. Unglamorous work, the kind that doesn't appear in the romantic tales of logging, but essential, because without clear paths the horses couldn't work, and without the horses the logs stayed where they fell. The teamsters were a breed apart, men who understood horses with an intimacy that went beyond simple animal handling. They could read a horse's mood by the set of its ears, could sense fatigue or strain before it became dangerous. And they had to, because a horse was valuable, worth $150 or more, far more than a man could earn in a month. And a good team could do the work of a dozen men if they were treated right, if they were fed well and not pushed beyond their limits. I think about those horses often, the Percherons and Belgians, the massive draft animals that were the engines of the logging industry, standing 16 hands high, weighing a ton or more, their breath steaming in the cold air, their hooves the size of dinner plates, shod with sharp caulks for gripping ice, and the care they received was extraordinary. Better housed than the men, their barn warm and weather-tight, their feed carefully measured, oats and hay brought in by the ton, because a horse that lost condition was a horse that couldn't work. The skidding itself was dangerous. Attaching chains to a log, making sure they were secure, then the teamster's call, the horses leaning into their collars, the chain going taut, and the log beginning to move, sliding across the snow, and if the chain broke under load, if it snapped like a rifle shot, the whipping metal could kill, or if a log shifted wrong, rolled unexpectedly, a man could be crushed before he could jump clear. At the landing, the loader crew took over, men with peavies and cant hooks, long-handled tools with a sharp point and a hinged hook, and they would roll the logs up skids onto the waiting sleigh, building the load with care, the largest logs on the bottom, the load carefully balanced, and when the sleigh was fully loaded, stacked higher than a man could reach, it might carry 20 tons, 30 tons, even more on a well-iced road with a strong team. The sleigh roads themselves were maintained constantly, a crew whose only job was keeping them smooth, keeping them iced, the water tank making its rounds at night, and there was an art to getting the ice just right, too thin, and it would crack under the weight, too thick, and the runners wouldn't slide properly, and the road crew became expert at reading conditions, at knowing when to add water, when to let it be, and then the great sleighs would begin their journeys, creaking and groaning under their loads, the horses straining, the teamster walking alongside, calling encouragement, watching for problems. And on downhill grades there was the hay, spread thick on the ice to slow the sleigh, because a runaway load was a catastrophe, tons of logs sliding faster and faster, the team unable to hold it back, and men had died that way, crushed when a load got away from them. The evenings in camp were brief, the men too tired for much beyond eating and collapse. But there were moments, Sunday afternoons sometimes, when no work was done, when someone might bring out a fiddle, or a man with a good voice might sing the old songs, the lumber camp ballads that told stories of the work, of disasters and triumphs, of men who died in the woods, of legendary loaders and sawyers, songs that served as the oral history of an industry, passed from camp to camp, from season to season. There was the jam on Jerry's Rock, about a river driver killed when a log jam broke, and the logger's boast, full of braggadocio and humor, and dozens of others, some with melodies borrowed from Irish or Scottish traditions, the lyrics adapted to fit the North American experience. And these songs did something important. They made sense of the work. They turned hardship into narrative. They gave men a way to understand their place in something larger than themselves. The food in the camps was legendary, not for quality perhaps, but for quantity. A camp cook feeding 50 men through a winter needed to be part quartermaster, part magician, working with supplies that had been hauled in during the fall, barrels of salt pork and flour, sacks of beans and dried peas, molasses by the gallon, dried fruit, canned milk, potatoes stored in root cellars dug into the frozen ground. And from these basic ingredients, the cook would produce meals that workers remembered decades later. Enormous pots of beans baked with molasses and salt pork, stews thick enough to stand a spoon in, bread baked daily in quantities that seem impossible, flapjacks by the hundreds, pies made from dried apples, and always the coffee, strong enough to strip paint, kept hot on the stove all day, because men coming in from the cold needed it, depended on it. The cookhouse was sacred space, the one warm, well-lit building in camp, and the cook's authority was absolute. Even the camp boss deferred to the cook in his own domain, because a good cook kept men fed and content, kept them working, while a bad cook could empty a camp in a week. Men voting with their feet, walking out to find another operation with better food. But beyond the daily rhythm of work and meals, there was the larger pattern of the season to consider, the way autumn turned to deep winter, and deep winter began, imperceptibly at first, to soften toward spring, and this transition was watched anxiously because the entire enterprise was a race against the thaw. All those thousands of logs piled at the landing had to reach the river before the ice roads melted, had to be rolled onto the ice of the river or lake before the breakup came. The spring breakup was an event, a transformation. Ice that had been solid enough to support buildings would suddenly turn rotten, honeycomb with meltwater, and then one day, often with startling suddenness, it would go out, the river breaking free of winter's grip. And this was the signal, the moment when logging transformed into river driving, when a different set of skills became paramount. The river drivers were specialists, men who could walk on floating logs as casually as others walked on solid ground, who could read water, understand currents, predict where a jam might form, and they would follow the logs downstream, riding them, guiding them, breaking up jams with peavies and dynamite, sleeping rough on the banks, eating cold food, working in water so cold it could kill in minutes. And this was considered the most dangerous work in an already dangerous industry. But I'm moving ahead, jumping past the deep winter, past the long months of cutting and skidding, and there's more to understand about that time, about the middle period of the season, January into February, when the work had found its rhythm, when the camp had settled into itself, when the initial excitement of the season had worn off, and what remained was simply the daily grind of labor. This was when injuries happened most often, when familiarity bred carelessness, when the cold was deepest and most unrelenting, when men's attention might wander, and a wandering attention in the woods could mean a saw bite, an axe glancing off and cutting a leg, a log rolling onto a foot, and the camp's medical care was rudimentary at best. Perhaps a foreman who had learned some basic first aid, a medicine chest with iodine and bandages, and the nearest doctor might be a 2-day journey away. The isolation was profound in some camps, particularly those in the more remote areas. There might be no contact with the outside world from November until April. No mail, no news, no visitors, just the closed circle of the camp, the same faces day after day, and this took a psychological toll, led to tensions, to feuds over trivial matters, to the occasional fight despite the rules against it. And yet there was also a camaraderie, a bond formed by shared hardship, by depending on each other in ways that town life never required. Men would speak of their bunkmates, their crew, with a loyalty that lasted lifetimes, would return year after year to the same camp, to work with the same men, because they had learned to trust each other, had survived together, and that meant something. The lumber barons themselves were mostly absent from this world. They stayed in offices in Saginaw or Minneapolis or Seattle. They made the deals, secured the financing, bought the timber rights, but they rarely visited the camps, rarely saw the actual work being done. And this distance, this separation between ownership and labor, was part of what would eventually lead to conflict to the labor movements that would rise in the early 20th century. But that too is getting ahead of the story. For now, in this middle period, we're dwelling in the late 1880s into the 1890s. The industry was at something like its peak, at least in terms of the old methods, the hand labor and horsepower that had brought it to this point. The camps were larger than ever, more efficient, more productive, and the cut was staggering. Michigan alone was producing billions of board feet annually. Entire forests disappearing in a generation. The technology was evolving too, though slowly, incrementally. The cross-cut saws were being refined, new tooth patterns that cut faster, handles designed for better grip, and the axes were works of art in their own way. Hand-forged heads of specific weights and profiles, handles of second-growth hickory, shaped to fit the individual user's hand and swing, and a good axeman could maintain his tools with remarkable precision, sharpening on a whetstone with patient strokes until the edge would shave hair from his arm. But the real changes, the ones that would transform everything but key, were beginning to appear at the margins. Steam power was coming to the woods, first in the form of steam donkeys, stationary engines that could pull logs with steel cables, doing the work of a dozen horse teams, and these machines were cumbersome, required enormous amounts of fuel, needed skilled engineers to operate them, but they hinted at what was coming, at the mechanization that would eventually make the traditional lumber camp obsolete. The railroads were pushing deeper into timber country too, logging railroads, narrow gauge lines built specifically to haul logs, and these opened up regions that had been inaccessible before, areas too far from rivers for water transport, too remote for ice roads, and the railroad changed the economics entirely, made year-round logging possible, eliminated the need for the Spring River Drive, and slowly the center of the industry began to shift from the Great Lakes states toward the Pacific Northwest, toward the vast stands of Douglas fir and redwood. In the Northwest, the trees were different, bigger in a way that defied belief. Douglas firs that could be 10 feet across, 15 feet, redwoods that dwarfed even those, and the logging techniques that had worked in Michigan and Wisconsin had to be adapted, expanded, because you couldn't fall a redwood with a simple cross-cut saw. You needed springboards, platforms inserted into notches, cut high in the trunk, above the swollen base, and the sawyers would stand on these narrow boards, 20 feet above the ground, and work from there, the saw singing through wood that might be 1,000 years old. The scale of logging in the Northwest was industrial from the beginning, less about individual skill and more about machinery, about steam donkeys and high-lead systems, cables strung through the forest like enormous spider webs, and the camps there were different too, less isolated, closer to towns, because the railroads made that possible, and the work was, if anything, more dangerous. The trees so large that when they fell, they could shatter like bombs, sending shrapnel of wood flying in every direction, killing men hundreds of feet away. But back in the Great Lakes region, in the early years of the 20th century, change was coming in a different form. The timber was running out. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in region after region, the great pine forests that had seemed inexhaustible were being cut over. The land left in a devastation of stumps and slash, and the companies were moving on, following the timber, leaving behind communities that had grown up around the mills, towns that suddenly had no reason to exist. There were attempts at conservation, voices raised in concern. Gifford Pinchot and others arguing for sustainable forestry, for replanting, for leaving seed trees. But the industry was not structured to think in those terms. The lumber barons had paid for the trees. They owned them. And the prevailing attitude was to extract maximum value as quickly as possible and then move on to the next stand, the next state, the next forest. The men who did the work, the actual lumberjacks, were changing too, or rather the workforce was diversifying. Where once it had been primarily men of Yankee stock, New Englanders who had followed the timber west. Now there were Scandinavians, Finns and Swedes and Norwegians who brought their own traditions, their own songs, their own ways of working, and French Canadians coming down from Quebec, and later, in the Northwest, Asian immigrants, Japanese and Chinese workers, each group adding to the mix, creating a culture that was uniquely North American, forged from many traditions. The Finns, in particular, left their mark. They brought the sauna to the logging camps, a luxury that might seem absurd in such rough conditions, but which was valued beyond measure, a chance to truly get clean, to sweat out the aches and cold. And they brought their radical politics too, their ideas about workers' rights and collective action, and the industrial workers of the world found fertile ground in the logging camps, where conditions were hard and profits flowed primarily to distant owners. The strikes began in the early 1900s, work stoppages, demands for better food, for safer conditions, for an 8-hour day instead of the dawn to dark schedule that had always prevailed, and some of these strikes succeeded, forcing improvements, while others were broken, sometimes violently. But the very fact of them showed that something was shifting, that the old paternalistic model of the lumber camp was no longer sustainable. World War I brought its own changes, a massive demand for lumber, for spruce especially, which was needed for aircraft construction, and the government took an active role, setting up the spruce production division, essentially militarizing logging in the Northwest. And this brought standardization, safety regulations, improvements in camp conditions, because the government needed production but also needed to maintain morale, needed to keep workers from fleeing to better conditions elsewhere. And then the war ended, and there was a brief boom, and then the economy contracted. And the 1920s brought a different kind of pressure, competition from the South, from the pine forests of Georgia and the Carolinas, where labor was cheaper and the trees grew faster, and from new materials too, concrete and steel beginning to replace wood in many applications, and the market for lumber became less certain, less reliable. The technology continued to advance. The chainsaw was being developed, crude and heavy at first, a two-man saw powered by a gasoline engine, but revolutionary nonetheless, because it could do in minutes what took hours with a crosscut. And the men who used these early chainsaws were pioneers of a sort, learning to handle tools that were dangerous, that could kick back, that required constant maintenance, but that increased productivity enormously. And with each technological advance, fewer men were needed. A crew with a chainsaw and a bulldozer could do the work of 50 men with hand tools and horses. And so the great camps began to shrink, to modernize, men going home at night instead of staying in bunkhouses, commuting to the woods in trucks instead of walking in for the season, and something was being lost, even as efficiency was being gained. The old-timers, the men who had worked in the camps in the 1890s, would shake their heads at the changes, would talk about how soft the modern loggers had it with their power tools and their shorter hours. And there was some truth in that, but there was nostalgia too, a selective memory that forgot the hardship, the cold, the injuries, the men who died young from the work, and remembered only the camaraderie, the sense of being part of something grand. By the 1930s, the Great Depression slowed everything. Mills closed, camps shut down. Men who had spent their lives in the woods found themselves unemployed, and some of them went into the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC camps that were in some ways the descendants of the logging camps. Young men living in the forest, doing conservation work instead of cutting, planting trees instead of felling them. And there was an irony in that the skills developed to harvest the forest were now being used to restore it. The Second World War brought another surge, another desperate need for lumber, for the construction of military bases, of ships, of 1,000 wartime applications, and the industry ramped up again. But this time with even more mechanization, with trucks replacing horses entirely, with tractors and loaders, and the number of men needed continued to decline even as production increased. And in the years after the war, in the late 1940s and into the 50s, the last of the old-style lumber camps closed. The bunkhouses were abandoned. The cook shacks fell into ruin, and logging became just another job, still dangerous, still hard, but no longer the all-consuming seasonal odyssey it had once been, no longer a world unto itself. The peak era, the time we've been moving through, was roughly from 1870 to 1920, 50 years when the great northern forests were systematically harvested, when tens of thousands of men spent their winters in the deep woods, when the lumber camp was a distinct and vital American institution, and by the middle of the 20th century it was essentially over, transformed beyond recognition, or simply gone. What remains now are traces, old photographs showing men standing beside enormous stumps, their axes resting on their shoulders, museums, displays of cant hooks and peaveys, a few preserved camp buildings, and the stories passed down through families of grandfathers and great-grandfathers who worked in the woods, who were part of that great extraction, that transformation of forest into the built environment we inhabit today. And there's the land itself, the cut-over regions of Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, where second growth and third growth forests now stand, smaller trees, younger trees, but forests nonetheless, recovering in their own time, their own way, and the clear cuts of the Pacific Northwest, some replanted, some naturally regenerating, the forest slowly reclaiming what was taken. The story has a weight to it, a complexity that resists simple judgments, because it was both an ecological catastrophe and an essential industry, both an exploitation and a livelihood, both a destruction of ancient ecosystems and the creation of the material basis for modern society. And the men who did the work were neither villains nor heroes. They were simply workers, doing what needed to be done, or what they were told needed to be done in the economic and social context of their time. And yet, if we step back from the timeline, from the march of decades and technological changes, and think instead about what it meant, what it really meant, to spend a winter in the deep woods, we might begin to understand something about the human side of all this, about the interior experience of men who lived for months in a world reduced to essential elements, work and weather, food and exhaustion, the company of other men, and the vast silence of the forest. There was a stripping away that happened in the camps of pretense, of social niceties, of everything that wasn't necessary, because when you're working 14 hours in temperatures that can kill you, when you're sharing a bunkhouse with 50 other men, when your survival depends on your strength and your attention and the reliability of your crew, the superficial falls away, and what remains is something more fundamental, more honest, perhaps, than what exists in the comfort of towns and cities. The men themselves were aware of this. You can see it in the letters some of them wrote, in the diaries a few kept, this sense that the woods changed them, made them different from the men they had been, or the men they became when they returned to civilization each spring. And there was often a pull, a drawback to the camps, despite the hardship, because something about that life spoke to them, answered some need that ordinary society couldn't meet. Perhaps it was the clarity of it, the way the work was tangible, immediate. You could see what you accomplished each day. The trees you felled, the logs you skidded, the deck growing at the landing, and there was satisfaction in that, in physical labor that produced visible results, in being part of a crew where everyone's contribution mattered, where competence was respected and incompetence couldn't hide. Or perhaps it was the rhythm, the way the days followed a pattern set by nature rather than by clock time. Up before dawn, because that's when winter dawn comes. Working until the light fails because winter light is precious. Eating when the cook rang the triangle. Sleeping when exhaustion demanded it. And there's something deeply human about living according to natural cycles, something we lose when we're governed entirely by artificial schedules and electric light. The relationship with the forest itself was complex, contradictory even, because these were men whose livelihood depended on destroying what they also, in some way, revered. They knew the woods intimately, could read sign like a language, could identify trees by their bark in darkness, could navigate by subtle landmarks, the shape of a ridge, the sound of a particular creek, and they took a kind of pride in their knowledge, in their ability to survive and work in conditions that would break city men, and yet they were also agents of the forest's destruction. And some of them felt the weight of cutting trees that had been alive since before their grandfathers were born, felt something like guilt, or at least ambivalence, though they rarely spoke of it directly, because what good would it do? The work had to be done, the contract had to be filled, and individual feelings didn't change the larger economic forces that drove the industry, the accidents, the injuries and deaths that were a constant presence, created their own kind of knowledge, awareness of mortality that was immediate and physical. Men saw their bunkmates crushed by falling trees, saw hands mangled by equipment, saw the quick death that could come from a moment's inattention. And this created a particular kind of fatalism, an acceptance that the work was dangerous and you might not survive it, but also a determination to do it well, to not let fear paralyze you, to maintain your skill and attention because that was your only real protection. There were rituals around death in the camps, informal ones, not written down anywhere, but understood. When a man died, His belongings would be gathered, his wages calculated, and someone, usually the walking boss or the camp clerk, would write a letter to his family if he had one, and the letter would be factual, brief, not dwelling on the circumstances, just stating what happened and when. And there would be a collection, usually, men contributing what they could to help with the funeral expenses or to support a widow. And then the work would continue, because it had to, because stopping wouldn't bring the dead man back, and his bunk would be filled by someone new, and within days it would be as if he'd never been there, except in the memories of the men who knew him, who might tell stories about him on Sunday afternoons, who might sing a verse about him if someone made up a ballad. And that was the memorial he got, brief and informal but genuine. The seasons marked time in a way that's hard to understand now, when we can have strawberries in January and heating in August, when climate control insulates us from weather. But in the camps, winter was absolutely dominant, inescapable. It dictated everything: the work, the clothing, the food, the very structure of daily life, and the progression from early winter to deep winter to late winter was something everyone was acutely aware of, because each phase had its own character, its own challenges. Early winter, November into December, was almost optimistic. The cold was bracing but not yet brutal. The days were shortening, but there was still decent light. The men were fresh, eager to prove themselves, and the work went quickly. But then came January, February, when the cold settled in like a permanent condition, when the sun barely cleared the horizon, when every day was a test of endurance. And this was when the camp either came together or fell apart, when leadership mattered, when the cook's skill could make the difference between a content crew and a rebellious one. And then March, when the light began to return, when temperatures moderated, when you could feel spring coming even though snow still lay deep, and there was a quickening, a sense of urgency, because the time for cutting was drawing to a close. The ice roads would soon be unusable, and everything had to be positioned for the river drive. All the winter's work had to be ready, and the pace increased, the hours lengthened. One final push before the transformation from logging to driving. The river drives themselves were a whole other world, a whole other story, and the men who specialized in that work were different from the sawyers and teamsters. They needed different skills, balance and agility, the ability to read water, a kind of fearlessness that bordered on recklessness, because walking on floating logs, jumping from one to another, riding them through rapids, this required a commitment to the moment, a complete presence that not everyone could manage. But even the drives were changing, becoming less necessary as railroads penetrated deeper into timber country. And by the 1920s, the great spring drives were mostly memory. Logs were being trucked or hauled by rail directly to the mills, and something wild was being tamed. Something dangerous and spectacular was being replaced by something safer and more efficient, but also less alive somehow, less vital. And so we come to the end of it, to the fading of the lumber camp era, to the closing of a chapter in North American history. And what lingers is not just the facts, the dates and production figures, the technological changes, but the human experience of it, the texture of that life, the particular quality of existence in those remote camps in the deep woods, the last men who worked in the old-style camps, who lived through entire winters in bunkhouses, who cut trees with crosscut saws and moved them with horse teams. Those men are gone now. The last of them died decades ago. And with them went a certain kind of knowledge, a bodily understanding of work and weather and wood that can't really be reconstructed from books or photographs. Though we try, though we preserve what we can in museums and historical societies, what remains in the landscape are the traces, the old railroad grades grown over with brush, the collapsed remains of camp buildings, the enormous stumps, rotting slowly, that mark where the great trees stood. And if you know where to look, if you walk the back country of Michigan or Wisconsin or the Pacific Northwest, you can find these remnants, these ghosts of an industry, and they speak quietly of what happened here. The forests have returned in their way, second growth and third growth, and in another century or two, maybe longer, they'll approach again the grandeur of what was lost. The trees won't be as large, perhaps. The ecosystems won't be quite the same, but there will be forests, life reasserting itself, the patient work of regeneration that proceeds whether we notice it or not. And in the small towns that were once mill towns, logging towns, there are still families who remember, grandchildren of lumberjacks who heard the stories, who preserve photographs, who feel a connection to that history, to the men who came before. And this, too, is a kind of continuation, a remembering that keeps something alive even as the physical reality recedes further into the past. The lumber that was cut during those peak decades, some of it is still in use, old growth boards in the frames of houses, timbers in the basements of century-old buildings, and this wood has qualities that modern lumber doesn't. The grain is tighter, the wood harder, because it grew slowly in the cold northern climate, and it will likely outlast the buildings it supports, will persist as a material remnant of forests that no longer exist. There's a certain poetry in that, in the way the forest was transformed but not destroyed, changed from living trees into the framework of human habitation. And the men who did that work, who spent their winters in the cold and their springs on the rivers, they were part of a transformation, witnesses to and agents of a change that shaped the continent. And now, as the story winds down, as we reach the natural end of this remembering, what I'm left with is images, fragments, the sound of a crosscut saw echoing through winter trees, the smell of a bunkhouse, smoke and wool and coffee, the sight of a great pine beginning its fall, the crown sweeping down through its own branches, the impact that shakes the ground, and the men themselves lean and hard from the work, their hands scarred and calloused, their faces weathered, standing in old photographs with a kind of dignity, a seriousness, as if they understood they were part of something significant, something that would be remembered, even if they couldn't quite articulate what or why. The peak Lumberjack Era. Those decades from the 1870s to the 1920s, when the northern forests fell and an industry reached its apex before beginning its long decline, it's a story of transformation, of labor and landscape, of men and trees and the intersection between human need and natural abundance. And it fades now into history, into memory, into the quiet of a winter forest where the wind moves through branches, where snow falls softly on ground that was once camp, where time moves forward but the past remains, layered beneath, waiting for anyone who cares to listen, to look, to remember. The story ends, as all stories must, but the forest continues, growing, changing, persisting, and somewhere in the space between what was and what is, the echo of axes, the song of saws, the voices of men long gone still resonate, faintly, like a dream half remembered, fading, fading, into silence. The sky is a canvas, and it changes every moment, without permission, without warning, just movement and light, and the slow exhale of the atmosphere above us. Tonight, the air feels different. There is weight to it, a thickness that suggests something is gathering, something immense and patient. And if we pay attention, if we allow ourselves to notice, we can sense the invisible architecture of the world's breath, the way pressure builds and releases, the way moisture climbs and falls, the way temperature shapes everything it touches. This is the realm of clouds and currents, of frontings that slide across continents like thoughts across a mind, of systems that spiral and pulse with a logic all their own. And to understand this realm is to understand that the air around us is never still, never empty, never merely background to our lives. It is always moving, always transforming, always carrying stories written in vapor and temperature and the subtle mathematics of evaporation. I have come to think of the atmosphere as a kind of living text, one that requires no translation, only attention, only the willingness to look up and recognize that what we call weather is not chaos, but pattern, not randomness, but the intricate unfolding of laws so fundamental they govern oceans and breath alike. There is a particular quality to the light just before a change in weather, a softening or sometimes a sharpening of the edges of things. And those who spend their lives watching the sky learn to read these shifts the way others might read a clock or a face or the surface of water disturbed by something moving beneath. The science of this watching, this patient observation of what the heavens do, has a name that sounds almost like poetry itself. Meteorology, from the Greek word meteoron, meaning things in the air, things aloft. And for thousands of years, humans have looked upward and wondered at and built systems of understanding from that wondering. Tonight, as the air presses close and the sky holds its particular shade of gray-blue, I find myself tracing the history of that wondering, the long, slow accumulation of knowledge about wind and rain, about the invisible rivers of air that flow above us, about the delicate instruments we have built to measure what cannot be seen but only felt. Because the atmosphere does not reveal itself easily, it requires instruments, imagination, and a kind of patience that measures itself not in minutes but in seasons, in years, in the careful comparison of one winter to another, one hurricane season to the next. And yet, for all our instruments and satellites and computer models, there remains something fundamentally mysterious about the sky, something that resists complete knowing, and perhaps that is part of what draws us to study it, the way it remains always slightly beyond our grasp, always capable of surprise. The temperature is dropping now, just slightly, a change so subtle it registers more as a feeling than a fact. And this feeling is itself a kind of data, the body's own meteorological station, reading the air through skin and breath, through the slight quickening of pulse that comes when pressure falls. Ancient peoples knew this feeling well. They watched birds and the behavior of smoke, the direction of clouds at sunrise, the smell of rain carried on wind from distant mountains. And from these observations, they built the first forecasts, the first attempts to say what the sky might do tomorrow, next week. When the planting season came, it was not always science in the way we understand science now. It was closer to art, or to the kind of knowledge that comes from living in intimate relationship with a place, knowing its moods, its tendencies, its rhythms across the wheel of the year. But even then, even in that pre-scientific watching, there was accuracy, there was real understanding, because the atmosphere is not arbitrary. It follows laws, and those laws can be learned through attention, through the careful noting of what precedes what follows what patterns repeat and which do not. And so the story of meteorology is not just the story of instruments and equations, though those will come. It is first the story of noticing, of the human impulse to make sense of the forces that surround us, to find order in the shifting vault of sky. The wind is picking up slightly, moving through invisible corridors, following paths determined by the rotation of the earth, by the heating of land and sea, by 1,000 factors that interweave to create this particular breeze at this particular moment, and nowhere else, and never quite this way again. The first person to truly think about the sky as something that could be understood rather than merely feared or revered may have been a Greek philosopher standing on a hillside sometime in the 4th century before the Common Era, watching clouds build over the Aegean Sea. His name was Aristotle, and in approximately 340 BCE, he wrote a text he called Meteorologica, a word that would eventually give us our modern term for the study of weather. Though his book covered far more than what we now think of as meteorology, it included thoughts on comets and earthquakes, on rainbows and thunder, on everything that happened in the realm between the earth and the moon. Aristotle believed that weather arose from exhalations, vapors that rose from the earth and interacted with heat and cold in the upper air. And while this theory would eventually prove incomplete, there was something profound in his basic intuition, that weather was not divine caprice, but natural process, something that could be observed and reasoned about. He noticed that rain came from clouds, that clouds formed when moist air cooled, that wind had patterns and directions that varied with the seasons, and he tried to organize these observations into a coherent system, a way of thinking about the atmosphere that made sense of its endless variations. For nearly 2,000 years, his text remained the foundational work on weather, copied and studied and argued over, even as other aspects of natural philosophy evolved. Meteorology remained largely where Aristotle had left it, a collection of observations and theories, but no systematic method of measurement, no instruments to make the invisible visible. The sky kept its secrets because there was no way to weigh the air, no way to measure its pressure or humidity with precision, no thermometer to say exactly how cold the rain was or how warm the summer wind. But slowly, over centuries, the tools began to emerge. In the early 1600s, a man named Galileo Galilei created a device called a thermoscope, a glass tube with a bulb at one end, open at the other, placed upside down in a basin of water, and as the air in the bulb warmed or cooled, the water level in the tube would fall or rise, not perfectly, not with precise numbers, but visibly, measurably. And this was the beginning of something new. The air had temperature, and temperature could be seen. A few decades later, in 1643, Galileo's student Evangelista Torricelli made an even more remarkable discovery. He filled a glass tube with mercury, sealed at one end, and inverted it into a dish of mercury, and the column of mercury in the tube fell, but not all the way. It stopped at a certain height, held there by something invisible, the weight of the air, pressing down on the mercury in the dish, holding the column aloft. This was the barometer, the first instrument to measure atmospheric pressure, and with it came a revelation. The air had weight, substance. It pressed down upon us with measurable force, and that force changed, rising and falling in ways that seemed connected to changes in weather. Torricelli noticed that before storms, the mercury column would fall, the air pressure dropping as the weather system approached, and before clear weather, the column would rise. And this meant that the atmosphere was not uniform, not constant, but dynamic, full of invisible waves and gradients that might be predictable. The same era brought the invention of the hygrometer, a device to measure moisture in the air, first attempted by Nicholas of Cusa in the 1400s using wool, which grew heavier as it absorbed moisture from humid air, and later refined by others using hair, which lengthens and shortens with changes in humidity. A phenomenon you can observe even now if you watch someone's hair react to a foggy morning. These instruments, simple as they were, transformed meteorology from philosophy to science, because now observers could attach numbers to their observations, could compare conditions in different places, could track changes over time with precision, and people began to keep weather journals, daily records of temperature and pressure and wind direction, small acts of documentation that accumulated into something larger, a growing archive of data, the atmosphere's autobiography written one day at a time. In England, a scientist named Robert Hooke proposed in 1663 that a network of observers should be established, all using standardized instruments, all recording their observations at the same times each day, so that weather patterns across a region could be understood, so that the movements of storms and fronts could be tracked. It was a vision ahead of its time, because the infrastructure did not yet exist. The instruments were not yet standardized. The means of communicating observations across distances was too slow. But the idea was planted that meteorology required coordination, collaboration, a shared project of watching the sky together. Meanwhile, in France, René Descartes was thinking about clouds, about how they formed and why they appeared in certain shapes. He proposed that tiny particles of water in the air came together to form visible vapor, an idea that moved closer to our modern understanding, though he lacked the ability to verify it in detail. And in 1667, Robert Hooke conducted an experiment that would prove foundational. He showed that air was necessary for combustion, and in doing so, began to reveal that the atmosphere was not a simple substance, but a mixture, composed of different elements with different properties. This would eventually lead to the discovery that air was primarily nitrogen and oxygen, with small amounts of other gases, each playing a role in the complex chemistry of weather, though that understanding would take more than another century to fully develop. The 1800s brought new energy to meteorology, driven by two forces, the spread of the telegraph and the increasing toll of storms on commerce and human life. Ships were lost at sea during hurricanes that struck without warning. Cities were battered by storms that seemed to arrive from nowhere. And as industrial society grew more complex, more dependent on transportation and trade, the cost of weather ignorance grew higher. In 1849, the Smithsonian Institution in the United States began organizing a network of volunteer weather observers, eventually numbering more than 600 stations, all telegraphing their observations to Washington each day, where they could be compiled into maps showing weather conditions across the continent. For the first time, meteorologists could see weather as a spatial phenomenon, not just what was happening here, but what was happening there and over there, and how those conditions related to one another. The maps revealed something extraordinary. Storms moved. They traveled across the landscape like invisible entities, following paths that could be traced, and if they could be traced, perhaps they could be predicted. A French scientist named Urbain Le Verrier became convinced of this possibility after a devastating storm struck the Black Sea in 1854, sinking Allied ships during the Crimean War. Le Verrier collected weather observations from across Europe on the day of the storm and the days before, and he showed that the storm had formed far to the west, had moved eastward in a trackable progression, and that if telegraphic warnings had existed, the ships could have been saved. This demonstration led to the establishment of storm warning services in France and then across Europe. The first organized attempts at weather forecasting, simple warnings based on observed conditions, telegraphed ahead of approaching storms. And in 1870, the United States established its own weather service, initially run by the Army Signal Corps, with observers stationed across the country, sending coded telegrams about temperature, pressure, wind, precipitation, and cloudiness 3 times each day. The data flowed to central offices where meteorologists drew maps, analyzed patterns, and issued forecasts, cautious predictions about what the weather might do in the next 12 to 24 hours. These early forecasts were crude by modern standards, often wrong, sometimes spectacularly so, but they represented a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with the sky, from passive observation to active prediction, from acceptance to anticipation. The theoretical understanding was advancing too. In the late 1800s, a Norwegian scientist named Wilhelm Bjerknes proposed that weather forecasting could become an exact science if enough observations could be gathered and enough mathematical calculations performed. The future state of the atmosphere could be computed from its present state. Weather as a problem in physics and mathematics. It was a beautiful idea, but practically impossible with the technology of the time. The calculations required were so numerous and complex that a human working with pencil and paper could not complete them faster than the weather actually changed. But the idea persisted and would wait for machines that could think faster than humans, machines that did not yet exist, but would come in time, as all tools eventually come when they are needed enough. The early decades of the 20th century brought meteorology into a new phase, one defined by war and necessity, because weather suddenly mattered in ways it never had before. Aircraft were taking to the skies, fragile machines of wood and fabric that could be torn apart by wind shear or brought down by icing, and pilots needed to know what waited for them in the clouds. what conditions lay ahead, whether the ceiling was high enough to navigate by sight or whether fog would trap them blind above unfamiliar terrain. The First World War made this urgency absolute. Battles were planned around weather, artillery trajectories were calculated with wind speed and direction. Poison gas attacks depended on favorable winds, and aircraft reconnaissance missions required clear skies or at least predictable cloud cover. And so meteorology became a military science taught to officers, integrated into operations, given resources and attention it had never received in peacetime. It was during this period, in the midst of that great conflict, that a Norwegian physicist named Wilhelm Bjerknes and his colleagues developed what would become known as the Bergen School of Meteorology, a revolutionary new way of understanding storms and weather systems. They were working in neutral Norway, relatively isolated from the war, but deeply affected by it nonetheless. Food was scarce, shipping was disrupted, and accurate weather forecasts became essential for the small fishing fleet that kept the population fed. Bjerknes and his team, which included his son Jakob and a brilliant young meteorologist named Tor Bergeron, began analyzing weather data with fresh eyes, looking for patterns that earlier meteorologists had missed, and they found something remarkable. They discovered that the atmosphere was not a gradual continuum of temperature and pressure, but rather divided into distinct masses of air, each with its own characteristics, its own temperature and humidity and density. A mass of cold air moving down from the Arctic, a mass of warm, moist air flowing up from the tropics. And where these masses met, something dramatic happened. The boundary between them was not smooth, not gradual, but sharp, a front like the front line of a battle, where two opposing forces collided, and along these fronts weather happened. Clouds formed, precipitation fell, winds intensified, because the different air masses did not blend peacefully. They fought, the cold air pushing under the warm air like a wedge, forcing it upward, and as the warm air rose, it cooled, and its moisture condensed, and rain or snow or thunderstorms erupted along the boundary. This was the polar front theory, and it explained so much that had been mysterious, why storms formed where they did, why they moved the way they moved, why certain cloud patterns preceded certain weather changes. The Bergen School introduced an entire vocabulary that meteorologists still use today: cold fronts and warm fronts, occluded fronts where a faster-moving cold front overtakes a warm front, stationary fronts where neither air mass advances, and the cyclones that form along these boundaries. Vast rotating systems hundreds or thousands of miles across, spinning counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere due to the Coriolis effect, that subtle force created by Earth's rotation. They drew weather maps that showed these fronts as lines with symbols, triangles for cold fronts, semicircles for warm fronts, a notation system that made the invisible structure of the atmosphere suddenly visible, suddenly comprehensible. And forecasters who learned to read these maps, who understood the life cycle of a mid-latitude cyclone, could predict with much greater accuracy what the weather would do in the coming hours and days. A warm front approaching meant steady rain or snow, clouds thickening from high cirrus to altostratus to nimbostratus, temperatures rising, winds shifting from east to south. A cold front meant a narrow band of intense weather, possibly thunderstorms, followed by clearing skies, dropping temperatures, winds veering from south to west to northwest. These patterns repeated endlessly across the middle latitudes where warm and cold air masses perpetually contested, where the atmosphere never found equilibrium but remained in constant dynamic tension. Meanwhile, other mysteries of the atmosphere were being unraveled. In the early 1930s, a pilot and meteorologist named Carl Gustav Rossby began studying the large-scale circulation patterns of the upper atmosphere, the rivers of air that flowed above the weather we experience at ground level. He discovered that the upper atmosphere contained waves, vast undulations in the jet stream, the narrow band of extremely fast winds that circles the globe at altitudes of 30,000 to 40,000 feet. These waves, which came to be called Rossby waves, meander north and south as they flow west to east, and their position and amplitude control where storms develop, where cold air plunges southward, where warm air surges northward. A deep trough in the jet stream creates conditions for storm development, while a ridge brings fair weather, and the waves themselves move and evolve, creating a dynamic pattern that influences weather across entire continents. Understanding the jet stream transformed meteorology because weather at the surface is ultimately driven by conditions aloft, by the circulation patterns at 5 miles up, where temperature differences between equator and poles create winds so powerful they can carry an aircraft backward despite its engines running at full thrust. The 1940s brought another revolution, radar, developed during the Second World War to detect aircraft. Radar could also detect precipitation, the radio waves bouncing off raindrops and ice crystals, returning echoes that could be displayed on a screen. And suddenly meteorologists could see inside storms, could watch squall lines march across the countryside, could identify the spiral bands of hurricanes, could spot the hook echo signature of a tornado-producing thunderstorm. Weather was becoming visible in new ways, not just the clouds we could see with our eyes, but the three-dimensional structure of precipitation, the intensity gradients within a storm, the movement and evolution of systems too large or too fast or too hidden by darkness to observe directly. The same decade brought another tool, the radiosonde, a small package of instruments carried aloft by weather balloon, measuring temperature and humidity and pressure as it rose, transmitting the data back to ground stations via radio twice a day at coordinated times around the world. Weather balloons were launched, rising through the troposphere, the layer of atmosphere where weather happens, up into the stratosphere beyond, sending back a vertical profile of atmospheric conditions. These soundings revealed the three-dimensional structure of the atmosphere, showing meteorologists not just what was happening at ground level, but how temperature and moisture and wind varied with altitude. Information essential for understanding storm development, for predicting whether scattered clouds would grow into thunderstorms, for knowing how stable or unstable the air mass was, and the data from thousands of these balloon launches collected over decades built up a climatology, a baseline understanding of what the atmosphere typically looked like at different times and places, against which unusual conditions could be identified. The 1950s brought the beginning of the computer age, and with it, the possibility that Wilhelm Bjerknes's dream of mathematical weather prediction might finally become practical. A mathematician named John von Neumann became fascinated by the challenge, and in 1950, a team he assembled made the first numerical weather prediction using ENIAC, one of the first electronic computers, to calculate how a simplified model of the atmosphere would evolve over 24 hours. The calculation took 24 hours to complete, which meant it was useless for actual forecasting, but it proved the concept weather could be computed. The equations of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics that governed atmospheric behavior could be solved numerically, and the results resembled actual weather patterns. As computers grew faster, and as the equations became more sophisticated, and as more observational data became available to initialize the models, numerical weather prediction became practical, then standard, then indispensable. By the 1960s, computers were running forecast models twice daily, calculating the expected evolution of weather patterns days into the future. And forecasters used these guidance products alongside their own experience and judgment to make predictions. And the forecasts were getting better, measurably better. Forecast accuracy was improving year by year as models improved and data coverage expanded. The 1960s also brought weather satellites, first TIROS-1 in 1960, sending back grainy black and white images of clouds. And for the first time, humans could see the weather systems they had been mapping from ground observations, could see the spiral structure of the mid-latitude cyclones, the clear eye of hurricanes, the vast blankets of stratus covering ocean basins. Satellites revealed the global atmosphere as a connected system, showed weather patterns over oceans and remote regions where no observers existed, provided continuous monitoring of developing storms and moving fronts. Later, satellites carried instruments beyond simple cameras, infrared sensors that could measure cloud top temperatures, microwave sensors that could see through clouds to measure precipitation, instruments that could profile atmospheric temperature and moisture from space, and the data flowed down to forecasting centers, was ingested into computer models, improved the initial conditions from which forecasts were calculated, and accuracy continued to improve. The late 20th century brought a deepening understanding of the atmosphere's complexity, an awareness that weather was not isolated phenomenon, but part of larger patterns, rhythms that pulsed across seasons and years and decades. Meteorologists began to recognize teleconnections, relationships between weather patterns in distant parts of the globe, the way conditions in the tropical Pacific could influence winter storms over North America, or how sea surface temperatures in the Indian Ocean could affect monsoons in Asia and droughts in Australia. The most famous of these patterns became known as El Niño, a warming of the eastern tropical Pacific that occurred every few years, disrupting normal weather patterns worldwide. Fishermen off the coast of Peru had known about it for centuries, noticing that some years the cold, nutrient-rich waters they depended on would give way to warm, sterile currents, and the anchovy fishery would collapse, and this often happened around Christmas. So they called it El Niño, the boy child, in reference to the Christ child. But meteorologists in the 1960s and 70s discovered that El Niño was not just a local phenomenon. It was coupled with changes in atmospheric pressure across the entire tropical Pacific, a seesaw of pressure between Indonesia and Tahiti that controlled trade winds and ocean currents and rainfall patterns. This coupled ocean atmosphere system, which scientists named the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, influenced weather globally, During El Niño years, certain regions tended toward drought while others received unusual rainfall. Winter storms tracked differently across North America. Hurricane activity shifted in the Atlantic. Understanding ENSO gave meteorologists a window into seasonal forecasting, the ability to say with some confidence that the coming winter might be wetter or drier, warmer or cooler than average, not day by day, but in general tendency. Other oscillations were discovered too. The North Atlantic Oscillation, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the Madden-Julian Oscillation, each operating on different time scales, each influencing weather in different ways, and all interacting with one another in a vast symphony of atmospheric motion. The atmosphere was revealing itself as far more interconnected than anyone had imagined, a single fluid system wrapping the entire planet, where disturbances in one region propagated in waves and eddies to distant continents, where everything influenced everything else. And as this understanding grew, another realization emerged that human activity was beginning to change the composition of the atmosphere itself. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the air, produced by burning fossil fuels, was rising measurably, and carbon dioxide trapped heat, absorbing outgoing infrared radiation and re-radiating it back toward the surface. Scientists had understood this greenhouse effect since the 19th century. A Swedish chemist named Svante Arrhenius had calculated as early as 1896 that doubling atmospheric carbon dioxide would warm the planet, but it had seemed a distant theoretical concern, something that might matter in centuries to come. By the late 20th century, it was becoming clear that the change was happening faster than anticipated and that it would profoundly affect weather and climate, the two terms often confused but meteorologically distinct. Weather is the specific condition of the atmosphere at a particular time and place. Today's temperature and yesterday's rainfall and tomorrow's wind. Climate is the statistical average of weather over long periods, the characteristic patterns of a region, the typical seasonal progression, the likelihood of extremes, and climate was changing, warming globally, though not uniformly, with polar regions warming faster than the tropics, and nighttime temperatures rising more than daytime temperatures, and the warmest days becoming warmer, while the coldest days became less cold. This warming began to show up in weather patterns, heat waves becoming more intense and lasting longer, heavy precipitation events becoming more frequent as a warmer atmosphere held more moisture, hurricanes potentially becoming more intense as they drew energy from warmer ocean waters. Meteorologists found themselves needing to become climatologists too, needing to understand not just what the atmosphere was doing today, but how the baseline was shifting, how the statistics were changing, how a warming world altered the context in which daily weather unfolded. The tools continued to evolve. Doppler radar became standard in the 1990s, measuring not just precipitation intensity, but also wind velocity within storms, allowing forecasters to detect rotation inside thunderstorms, to issue tornado warnings with greater lead time and accuracy. Weather satellites moved from polar orbits that viewed each location only twice daily to geostationary orbits where satellites hovered over the same spot on the equator, providing continuous monitoring, images every 15 minutes or faster, allowing forecasters to watch storms develop and intensify in near real time. Computer models grew more sophisticated, moving from grid spacing of hundreds of kilometers to tens of kilometers to just a few kilometers, resolving individual thunderstorms rather than just large-scale systems, running ensemble forecasts that calculated multiple possible futures to quantify uncertainty, and the Internet transformed how weather information reached people. No longer did forecasts arrive only through newspaper or television. Now anyone could access radar images, satellite loops, hourly forecasts, warnings, all updated continuously, the atmosphere's current state available at any moment on any device. The early 21st century brought an explosion of observational data from new satellite instruments, from networks of surface sensors, from commercial aircraft equipped with meteorological instruments that reported temperature and wind at cruising altitude, from wind profilers and lightning detection networks and coastal radar installations. All this data flowed into forecast models, billions of observations every day, assimilated through complex mathematical techniques into a coherent picture of the atmosphere's current state, the initial conditions from which predictions were computed, and the forecasts kept improving. 7-day forecasts in the 21st century were as accurate as 3-day forecasts had been in the 1980s. Hurricane track forecasts improved dramatically. Tornado warning lead times increased. Winter storm predictions became reliable days in advance. Yet for all the progress, for all the satellites and supercomputers and sophisticated understanding, the atmosphere retained its essential mysteriousness, its capacity for surprise. Small errors in initial conditions still grew exponentially in forecast models. Chaos, in the mathematical sense, where tiny uncertainties multiplied until predictions became meaningless beyond a certain time horizon. Roughly 10 days for large-scale patterns, less for small-scale phenomena like individual thunderstorms. This fundamental limit, discovered in the 1960s by meteorologist Edward Lorenz, meant that perfect prediction was impossible, that weather would always hold some element of uncertainty, some resistance to complete knowing. Lorenz had been running a simple computer model of atmospheric convection, and one day he restarted a simulation from the middle, entering what he thought were the same initial conditions, but he had rounded the numbers slightly, entering point 506 instead of point 506,127, a difference of 1 part in several thousand. The two simulations started almost identically, but diverged slowly at first, then dramatically, until they bore no resemblance to each other at all. This sensitivity to initial conditions, later popularized as the butterfly effect, the idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil might ultimately influence whether a tornado forms in Texas, meant that perfect weather prediction would require perfect knowledge of every molecule in the atmosphere, something forever beyond reach. And so meteorology learned to live with uncertainty, to quantify it, to communicate it, to run many forecasts with slightly different initial conditions and see how much they differed, to give probabilities rather than certainties, to acknowledge the limits of prediction while still pushing those limits further every year. The science matured into something both powerful and humble, capable of seeing hurricanes days before they struck, of tracking winter storms across continents, of understanding the mechanisms that drove weather from planetary scale to cloud scale, yet always aware of how much remained unknown, how much complexity still hid in the equations, how the atmosphere continued to produce phenomena that surprised even the most experienced forecasters. And through all of this, through all the technological advancement and theoretical sophistication, the fundamental act of meteorology remained unchanged, watching the sky, noting what it does, trying to understand why, trying to anticipate what comes next. The instruments have grown more precise, the theories more complete, the forecasts more accurate, but the subject remains the same. This envelope of air wrapped around a spinning planet, heated unevenly by a star, set into motion by that heating, cycling water from ocean to cloud to rain to ocean, never still, never finished, never twice the same. And perhaps this is what makes meteorology so compelling, not just as science but as practice, as daily encounter with the world's fundamental restlessness. Every morning, somewhere, a forecaster sits before screens glowing with data, satellite images cycling, radar sweeping, model outputs scrolling, and tries to discern what the atmosphere will do today, tomorrow, this week. It is part science and part art, reading patterns in the data the way a musician reads a score, seeing not just the notes but the melody, not just the numbers but the story they tell about rising air and falling pressure and moisture, streaming northward from tropical seas. There is beauty in a well-organized low-pressure system, the way the comma-shaped cloud shield wraps around the center, the way the fronts extend outward like arms reaching, the way the whole structure rotates slowly, gracefully, like something choreographed. There is drama in a developing thunderstorm, watching on radar as a modest echo suddenly intensifies, as rotation appears in the Doppler velocity data, as the storm takes on that particular structure that means it has become dangerous, that it now carries within it the possibility of a tornado, and warnings must be issued, and people must take shelter. There is quiet satisfaction in a forecast that verifies when the predicted temperature matches the observed, when the rain begins when expected and ends when anticipated, when all the complexity of atmospheric physics resolves into an outcome you correctly anticipated, not through luck, but through understanding, and there is humility in the forecasts that fail, when the storm track shifts unexpectedly, when the rain-snow line sets up 50 miles north of where every model suggested, when conditions that seemed certain prove uncertain after all. The atmosphere teaches patience because it operates on its own schedule, not human time. A hurricane may take 2 weeks to develop from a tropical wave to a major storm. A tornado may form and dissipate in 20 minutes. A drought may persist for years, and none of these processes can be hurried or delayed by human desire. It teaches attention because the signal is often subtle, a slight veering of the wind, a small drop in pressure, a change in cloud texture that suggests instability aloft. And these small signs matter. They are the language the atmosphere speaks to those who learn to listen. It teaches interconnection, because nothing in the atmosphere happens in isolation. The temperature here depends on the wind there, which depends on the pressure gradient somewhere else, which depends on solar heating and Earth's rotation and the distribution of land and sea. Everything touching everything causes spreading in ripples too complex to fully trace. And in recent decades, it has taught us something else, that we are not merely observers of the atmosphere, but participants in it, that our choices about energy and land use and industrial development have become geological forces, altering the composition of air, changing the baseline against which all weather now unfolds. The carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere has risen from about 280 parts per million in pre-industrial times to over 420 parts per million today, a change faster than any natural variation in the past million years. And that change is altering weather patterns, shifting climate zones, intensifying some extremes while diminishing others. Meteorologists now forecast in an atmosphere different from the one their predecessors studied. Warmer, moister, more energetic, and they must factor this altered baseline into their predictions, must understand not just atmospheric physics, but human impacts on atmospheric chemistry, must communicate not just daily weather, but long-term trends. The scope has expanded from predicting tomorrow's high temperature to projecting how heat waves will change over coming decades, from tracking individual hurricanes to understanding how hurricane intensity distributions are shifting, from forecasting seasonal rainfall to anticipating how drought patterns might evolve in a warming world. Yet the core remains watching, measuring, calculating, trying to understand this fluid shell of air that makes Earth habitable, that cycles water and moderates temperature and shields us from solar radiation, that gives us blue skies and sunsets, rain for crops and wind for sailing, and occasionally storms that remind us how powerful the atmosphere is, how little control we truly have. There is something profound in standing outside before a thunderstorm, feeling the temperature drop as the outflow arrives, watching the shelf cloud advance, knowing that above you the atmosphere is in violent motion, updrafts rising at 60 miles per hour, downdrafts plunging, hail forming in the anvil cloud, electricity building between cloud and ground, all of it following physical laws that we understand, yet still wild, still untamed, still dangerous, or watching hurricane satellite imagery, seeing the eye form, the symmetry develop, the spiral bands tighten, this atmospheric heat engine extracting energy from warm ocean water and converting it to wind, to rain, to storm surge, capable of destroying cities, yet also part of Earth's climate system, part of how the planet redistributes heat from tropics to poles, necessary, natural, and increasingly influenced by the warming we have caused. The atmosphere is always teaching, always presenting new puzzles, new patterns, new questions. Why did this storm intensify so rapidly when the models suggested a gradual strengthening? What feedback processes were at work? What did we miss in our understanding or our observations? Why does the jet stream sometimes get stuck in a particular pattern, creating persistent heat waves or flooding rains? What interactions between ocean and atmosphere and land surface lock the pattern in place? How exactly do ice crystals form in clouds? What processes govern whether a storm produces rain or snow or freezing rain? How do aerosols affect cloud development and precipitation efficiency? The questions never end, because the atmosphere's complexity is inexhaustible. Every answer reveals new questions. Every solved problem points toward unsolved ones. And so meteorology continues this centuries-long project of understanding the sky, building on Aristotle's observations and Torricelli's barometer, and Bjerknes's fronts and Lorentz's chaos, adding new tools and techniques and insights, improving forecasts and expanding understanding, but never complete, never finished. always reaching toward fuller knowledge of this essential element in which we live. The evening is settling now, and the clouds that have been building all day are beginning to organize, beginning to show structure. Dark bases and bright edges catching the last sunlight, the barometer has fallen steadily through the afternoon, the pressure dropping as the low-pressure system approaches, and the wind has shifted, backing from south to southeast, a sign that the warm front is near. Soon the rain will begin, steady rain. Stratiform precipitation from clouds that span hundreds of miles. Moisture that evaporated from the Gulf of Mexico day ago, that rose into the atmosphere and traveled northward on southerly winds, that will fall here tonight and seep into soil and flow into streams and eventually make its way to the ocean again, completing one more cycle in the endless circulation. And somewhere, a forecaster is watching this system, monitoring its progress, comparing observations to model predictions, preparing to update the forecast, continuing the work of reading the atmosphere, interpreting its signals, anticipating its next move, the work that began with ancient observers watching clouds and wind, that continued through centuries of instrument development and theory building, that accelerated with computers and satellites and radar, that goes on tonight and every night in forecast offices around the world, this patient effort to understand what the sky will do. It is work that matters because weather touches everything: agriculture and transportation, energy demand and water supply, outdoor events and indoor comfort, safety and planning, and the simple question of whether to carry an umbrella tomorrow. But perhaps it also matters for another reason, because paying attention to weather means paying attention to the world, noticing the wind and clouds, feeling temperature changes, watching the sky's endless variations, being present to this dynamic atmosphere that surrounds us. And in that attention, there is a kind of wonder, a recognition of the beauty and complexity of physical processes playing out overhead, invisible mostly, noticed only in their effects, but always there, always in motion, always unfolding according to laws we increasingly understand but can never fully master. The rain is beginning now. First drops tapping against windows, then steady, soaking into ground that needs it. Welcome rain from clouds that formed according to principles of thermodynamics and fluid dynamics, that were seeded by dust particles lifted from distant deserts, that grew and merged and organized into this system that a forecaster predicted days ago. And it will rain through the night, and tomorrow the front will pass, and the cold air will arrive, and the sky will clear, and the cycle will continue as it always has, as it always will, the atmosphere breathing, circulating, never still, never finished. The rhythm of weather, the pulse of the planet, continuing, always continuing. There is something ancient in the act of placing one stone upon another, something that reaches back through the millennia to the very first moment when human hands shaped the world around them, when shelter became more than protection and began to whisper of something deeper, something that spoke to the soul. Tonight, we trace a thread through time, a golden thread that winds through the dust of ages, connecting the earliest circles of stone on a windswept hill to towers of glass that pierce the desert sky. Each structure a fingerprint, each building a breath, each space a memory carved into the earth itself. The story begins in darkness. Not the darkness of fear, but the rich darkness of possibility, the kind of darkness that existed before walls, before columns, before the very idea of architecture had been born into the world, and in that darkness, beneath stars that seemed close enough to touch, people gathered around fires and wondered how to make meaning from the landscape around them. Imagine standing on a hilltop in what would one day be called Turkey, the wind moving through grasses that have witnessed countless sunrises, the earth beneath your feet holding secrets that would sleep for thousands of years. And there, rising from the ground like thoughts made solid, are the first deliberate arrangements, the first conscious shaping of stone that reached beyond mere survival. This is Göbekli Tepe, a name that means Potbelly Hill. And here, more than 11,000 years ago, before pottery, before writing, before the invention of the wheel, people carved massive pillars from bedrock, lifted them skyward, and arranged them in circles that spoke a language we are still learning to read. The pillars stand taller than 3 men, their surfaces alive with images, foxes and scorpions, birds and serpents, all flowing across the stone in relief, as if the animals themselves had emerged from within, seeking the light. And between these pillars, in the spaces they created, something new entered the world, the architecture of gathering, the geometry of the sacred. There were no homes here, no granaries, no practical structures of daily life, only these circles, these temples, these spaces carved from intention and something like prayer. And what this tells us, what it whispers across the ages, is that the impulse to build, to create spaces that elevate experience, came before almost everything else we consider civilized. The people who raised these stones were not farmers, not city dwellers. They were hunters, gatherers, moving with the seasons, and yet they returned to this hill, generation after generation, to add new circles, new pillars, new voices to the conversation in stone, suggesting that architecture, true architecture, was born not from necessity, but from yearning. Standing among those pillars, if we could travel back through the layers of time, we would feel the same thing their builders felt, the way space changes when it is defined, how a circle of stones becomes a world unto itself, how the simple act of enclosure creates a threshold, an edge between the ordinary and the extraordinary. And from that hilltop, from those first circles, the thread extends forward, through millennia of innovation and dream, through pyramids that caught the sun like frozen light, through temples where columns held up not just roofs, but entire cosmologies, through cathedrals that taught stone to soar, through palaces where walls became canvases, through stations where iron learned to dance, through towers that raced toward clouds, and finally to structures so complex, so layered with technology and vision, that they seem to come from futures we haven't yet inhabited. Each age added its voice to the conversation, each culture its vocabulary, and what emerges when we step back and see the whole is not a story of progress, not a simple line from primitive to sophisticated, but something more beautiful, more complex, a braided river of human imagination flowing through time, sometimes running deep and slow through centuries, sometimes rushing forward in cascades of innovation, but always moving. The Sphere in Las Vegas, that impossible globe of light and image rising from the Nevada desert, shares something essential with those first circles in Anatolia. Both are spaces designed to alter consciousness, to lift experience beyond the everyday, to create a world within the world, one through the arrangement of carved stone under open sky, the other through pixels and sound and immersive wonder, yet both asking the same question: what can space do to us and for us when it is shaped with intention? Between these 2 points, between that ancient hill and that contemporary marvel, lies the entire story of how we learned to think in space, how we discovered that walls could teach, that doorways could transform, that windows could frame not just views but philosophies, that buildings could become books written in stone and steel and glass. And so we begin to walk this thread, to move slowly through the ages, not rushing, never rushing, but allowing each era to unfold in its own time, each structure to reveal its secrets, each innovation to show us not just what changed, but what remained constant: the human need to make meaning through making space, to build not just for shelter, but for the soul. The first shelters were not architecture. They were instinct, caves chosen for their depth, overhangs selected for their angle against the rain, arrangements of branches that mimicked the nests of birds. But somewhere in the long dawn of human consciousness, something shifted and shelter became statement. In the Fertile Crescent, where rivers carved abundance from desert, where wild grains grew thick enough to sustain permanence, the first mud bricks were shaped by hands that understood, truly understood, that earth could be transformed, that the ground beneath our feet held within it the possibility of walls. Jericho rose from the Jordan Valley like a promise, its tower, built of stone and mud brick around 8,000 years before our current era, standing nearly 9 meters tall, solid, massive, reaching upward for reasons we can still only guess at: defense, perhaps, or astronomy, or the simple human need to create a marker, a statement that said we are here, we endure, we build. The stones fit together without mortar, each one chosen, placed, wedged, the accumulated weight holding everything in place through sheer mass and intention. And inside the tower, a staircase spiraled upward, 22 steps carved from stone, leading to a platform where someone could stand above the settlement, above the walls, and see the world from a new perspective. This matters more than it might seem, this vertical achievement, because architecture is always about perspective, about creating new ways to experience space, new relationships with earth and sky. And that tower, that simple stone tower, was among the first to offer humans a view from above, a God's eye glimpse of their own creation. Not far from Jericho, across landscapes that knew the footsteps of countless generations, another settlement emerged from the dust of prehistory, Catalhoyuk, where between 7,000 and 6,000 years ago, people built homes that touched, that shared walls, creating a honeycomb of domestic space where roofs became streets, where entry came through openings in the ceiling, where the entire settlement formed a single interconnected mass. There were no doors and walls, no windows looking outward. Instead, the homes opened upward, ladders reaching towards sky, and people moved across the rooftops like water, flowing from home to home, the architecture creating a kind of communal privacy, intimate yet connected, individual yet woven together, Inside these homes, walls bore paintings, bulls and leopards, hunting scenes and geometric patterns. The dead were buried beneath the floors, ancestors sleeping under the feet of the living, and the architecture became a vessel, holding not just bodies but memory, not just shelter but story, the walls themselves becoming the record of human experience. Move westward, across the Mediterranean to the islands where stone rises white from blue water, and you find the temples of Malta, built between 5,000 and 3,000 years before our era, massive limestone blocks, some weighing more than 20 tons, quarried, transported, lifted, arranged into structures whose purpose speaks clearly across the millennia. These were temples, spaces carved from devotion, their interiors shaped like the bodies of earth mothers, rounded chambers flowing one into another like organs, like wombs, the architecture itself a prayer in stone, and the builders, working with tools of stone and wood and bone, achieved something that still startles, still stops the breath. They carved spiral patterns into the walls. They created corbelled roofs that seemed to float. They aligned doorways with celestial events, solstices and equinoxes marking time in light and shadow, at Hagar Kim, at Menajdra, at Tarxian. The temples stand as evidence of something we sometimes forget, that sophistication is not the product of technology alone, that profound architecture can emerge from cultures we too easily call primitive, that vision and skill and dedication can transform stone into sanctuary regardless of era. And then Egypt, the Nile, that ribbon of life flowing through desert, created conditions unlike anywhere else on earth, annual floods that brought both water and fertile silt, a rhythm so reliable it became the foundation of civilization. And along that river, architecture evolved from mud, brick, and reed to stone, eternal stone, architecture designed not for the living alone, but for the forever. The first pyramids were steps. The pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, rising in 6 distinct layers, around 4,600 years ago. The architect Imhotep, whose name we still remember when so many have been lost to time, took the traditional mastaba tomb, that flat rectangular structure, and stacked them, each level smaller than the last, creating a stairway to heaven in stone. But the step pyramid was a beginning, not an end, and within a few generations the angles changed, the steps smoothed, and at Giza the pyramids took their final form, perfect triangular faces rising from square bases, geometry made massive, mathematics carved into the desert floor. The Great Pyramid, built for Khufu, contains more than 2 million blocks of stone, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, some weighing as much as 80 tons, quarried, transported, lifted, placed with precision that still defies complete explanation, the sides aligned to cardinal directions with accuracy that modern instruments barely improve upon, the chambers within designed with such care that air shafts, barely the width of a hand, run for hundreds of feet through the solid rock. This was architecture as cosmic diagram. The pyramid itself a representation of the primordial mound, the first earth rising from the waters of chaos, its peak a point of transformation where the earthly touched the divine, and the entire Giza complex, with its 3 pyramids, its causeways and temples, its precise astronomical alignments, formed a map of heaven written on earth. Inside the pyramids, corridors descended into darkness, burial chambers waited in silence, and walls in later pyramids became covered with hieroglyphs, the pyramid texts, spells and prayers carved into stone, architecture becoming scripture, space becoming language. But pyramids were not the only innovation. The Egyptians learned to carve temples from living rock. At Abu Simbel, 4 colossal statues of Ramesses II sit in eternal watch, each more than 20 meters tall, carved from the cliff face itself, and behind them chambers penetrate deep into the mountain, their walls covered with scenes of triumph and devotion, and twice a year, on specific days, sunlight penetrates the entire depth of the temple, illuminating statues in the innermost sanctuary. Architecture and astronomy joined in purpose. At Karnak, columns rose like forests, their capitals blooming with lotus and papyrus. The hypostyle hall, with its 134 columns, some more than 20 meters tall, created a space unlike anything that had existed before. Walking among those columns was like moving through a stone grove, light filtering down from clear story windows, shadows pooling in corners, the scale designed to reduce the human, to create awe through sheer immensity. The Egyptians understood proportion. They worked with grids and canon, mathematical relationships that governed everything from the smallest statue to the largest temple. And this mathematical precision gave their architecture a kind of eternal quality, as if these structures had always existed, as if they would exist forever. Across the Mediterranean, another culture was learning to speak in stone, the Minoans of Crete, builders of palaces that sprawled across hillsides, complexes so labyrinthine they may have inspired legends. Knossos, with its hundreds of rooms, its grand staircase, its light well system that brought illumination deep into the interior, its walls covered with frescoes showing dolphins and flowers, bull lepers and processions. The Minoan architecture was different from Egypt's, lighter, more playful, columns that tapered downward instead of upward, red and black in color, creating rhythms across facades, courtyards that opened to sky, storage rooms that held massive pithoi, those enormous ceramic jars, tall as a man, filled with oil and grain and wine. There was an organic quality to these palaces, rooms added as needed, levels rising and falling with the terrain, staircases appearing in unexpected places, the whole complex breathing, expanding, adapting. And though earthquakes brought these palaces down again and again, the Minoans rebuilt, each time adding, refining, continuing the conversation in stone and plaster. And then the Mycenaeans, warriors from the mainland, who built with different intentions. Their architecture spoke of defense, of power consolidated. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, with its massive relieving triangle, its carved lions flanking a central column, announced that those who entered were entering a fortress, a place of kings. The Cyclopean walls, built of stones so massive that later Greeks believed only the mythical Cyclopes could have moved them, enclosed citadels that commanded hilltops, and within those walls, megaron halls, rectangular rooms with central hearths, 4 columns supporting roofs. These became the template, the ancestor of forms that would evolve into the temples of classical Greece, the tholos tombs, beehive chambers buried in hillsides, showed that the Mycenaeans understood corbelling, understood how to stack stones in ever-decreasing circles until they met at a central point, creating domed spaces without true arches, the treasury of Atreus, with its entrance passage and massive lintel stone, its interior chamber perfect in its geometry, demonstrated architectural sophistication that rivaled anything being built anywhere in the world. But civilizations rise and fall, and the Bronze Age collapsed, taking with it the palace cultures, the trade networks, the literacy, and for centuries, the Dark Age. Architecture simplified, returned to basics. The grand structures fell to ruin, were quarried for stone, were forgotten, until slowly, gradually, in the valleys and islands of Greece, something new began to grow, a different vision of what architecture could be, what it could mean, what it could say about humanity and divinity and the relationship between them. The Greeks began with wood, temples that have vanished completely, leaving only descriptions in ancient texts. But wood taught them proportions, taught them the relationships between column and beam, between support and weight. And when they began to translate these forms into stone, around the 7th century before our era, something extraordinary happened. They created a language. The Doric order emerged first, sturdy, powerful, columns rising directly from the platform. No base, their shafts carved with 20 shallow flutes that caught light and shadow, swelling slightly in the middle, that subtle curve called entasis, which corrected the optical illusion that would make straight columns appear to bend inward. And at the top, the capital, simple, geometric, a cushion and a square supporting the entablature above. Every element had a name, a purpose, a proportion relative to every other element. The Greeks were not just building, they were composing, creating visual music in stone. And the Parthenon, rising on the Acropolis of Athens around 447 years before our era, represented the perfection of this language. From a distance, the Parthenon appears to be all right angles, all straight lines, but approach closer, measure carefully, and the truth reveals itself. There is not a single straight line in the entire structure. The platform curves upward in the center, rising more than 6 centimeters along the facade. The columns lean inward slightly. The corner columns are thicker than the others and placed closer together. Every spacing, every measurement, adjusted to account for how the human eye perceives, how distance and light alter appearance. The architects Ictinus and Callicrates, working with the sculptor Phidias, created a building that breathed, that seemed alive despite being solid marble. And the sculptural program, the metopes showing mythological battles, the frieze depicting the Panathenaic procession, the pediments filled with gods and heroes, all of this carved with such a skill that figures seemed to move, seemed to possess weight and breath, drapery falling in folds so realistic you want to touch the stone to confirm it is not fabric. Inside the cella, that inner chamber held a statue of Athena, 12 meters tall, covered in gold and ivory, and the space around her, columns on 3 sides, created a frame, a sacred precinct within a sacred precinct. Architecture and sculpture merged into single vision. But Greek architecture was not only about temples. The theater at Epidaurus, built in the 4th century before our era, carved into a hillside, its semicircular tiers of seats, 55 rows accommodating 14,000 people, demonstrated an understanding of acoustics so profound that a coin dropped in the orchestra circle can be heard in the highest seats. The geometry itself amplifying sound, focusing it, carrying it upward through stone. The stoa, those long covered walkways with columns on one side, created public space, places to gather, to talk, to conduct business. The stoa of Attalos in Athens, reconstructed in modern times, shows how these structures define the edges of agoras, those civic hearts where democracy itself was practiced, where architecture created the stage for public life. And then Rome, who learned from the Greeks, borrowed their orders, adapted their forms, but added something the Greeks had never fully embraced: the arch, the vault, the dome, the revolutionary understanding that space itself could be shaped, that interiors could become as important as exteriors. The Romans discovered concrete, that miraculous mixture of lime and volcanic ash and aggregate, pozzolana, which could be poured into forms, which grew stronger underwater, which allowed spans and weights impossible in cut stone. And with concrete, Roman architecture exploded into new possibilities. The Pantheon, completed under Hadrian around 126 years after the Common Era began, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built, 43.3 meters in diameter, the same measurement from floor to oculus, creating a perfect hemisphere, a space that feels both intimate and infinite. Stand in the center, look up through the oculus, that 9-meter opening at the dome's apex, the only source of light, and watch as the sun moves across the interior, a shaft of light traveling across coffers, those recessed panels that reduce weight while adding rhythm, the smoke from ancient offerings rising through that opening, rain falling through it, puddling on the floor. The elements themselves invited into the sacred space. The dome's thickness decreases as it rises, from 6 meters at the base to just 1.2 meters at the oculus, and the concrete changes, heavier aggregate of basalt and travertine at the bottom, lighter pumice toward the top, engineering and material science working together to achieve what appears effortless, what feels like stone floating. The Romans built aqueducts, the Pont de Garde in France, 3 tiers of arches carrying water across a valley, precision in every stone. No mortar, just perfect cutting and placement. Some blocks weighing 6 tons, lifted into place, fitted so exactly that the structure has stood for 2,000 years. They built amphitheaters, the Colosseum, the Flavian Amphitheater, capable of holding 50,000 spectators, its facade a lesson in the orders, Doric on the ground level, Ionic on the second, Corinthian on the third, pilasters on the fourth, and inside, a complex system of tunnels and chambers, the hypogeum, where gladiators and animals waited, where mechanisms lifted combatants to the arena floor, where architecture became theater, became spectacle. They built baths, the baths of Caracalla, where vaulted spaces soared, where hot and cold rooms, the caldarium and frigidarium, were arranged in sequence, where exercise yards and libraries and gardens created entire complexes devoted to the care of body and mind, where mosaic floors depicted oceans teeming with life, where walls were faced with marble from across the empire, colored stones speaking of conquest and connection. The Romans built across 3 continents, from Britain to Syria, from Spain to Egypt, and everywhere they built. They brought arches and vaults, forums and basilicas, temples and theaters, aqueducts and roads, architectural vocabulary that unified diverse peoples under common forms, the basilica, that rectangular hall with its high central nave and lower side aisles, originally a space for commerce and law, would be adopted by a new religion rising from the provinces. And as Rome itself transformed, as Christianity became not just permitted but preferred, the basilica became the church, became the template for sacred space in a new age. Constantine's Basilica of St. Peter, built in the 4th century, took the Roman form, the long nave, the side aisles, the clear story windows bringing light from above, and oriented it, made it processional, the entrance at one end, the altar at the other, the journey through space becoming a spiritual journey, a movement toward the sacred. But even as Christian architecture emerged, even as the empire divided, east and west, old forms persisted, evolved. In Byzantium, in Constantinople, the Emperor Justinian built Hagia Sophia, completed in 537, and created something the world had never seen. The architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, mathematicians both, designed a central dome, 31 meters in diameter, rising 56 meters above the floor, seeming to float, seeming to hover without support. And the secret, the innovation, was the pendentive, those curved triangular sections that transition from the square base to the circular dome, that distribute weight to 4 massive piers that make the impossible appear effortless. Light floods through 40 windows ringing the dome's base, making the dome appear to float on a crown of light, and inside, gold mosaics cover every surface, reflecting candlelight, multiplying illumination, creating an interior that seems to glow from within, that dissolves materiality into radiance. The Byzantine architecture spread east to Russia, where onion domes would bloom like flowers against snow, west to Ravenna, where San Vitale's octagonal plan and mosaic programs created jewel box spaces, south to North Africa, each region adapting, adding, creating variations on themes of dome and vault and mosaic. In the west, as Rome fell and Europe fragmented, architecture became heavier, darker, the Romanesque style, with its thick walls and small windows, its rounded arches and barrel vaults, its sense of fortress and refuge, monasteries and churches built to endure, built to protect not just bodies, but faith itself through uncertain times. The Abbey Church at Cluny, once the largest church in Christendom, demonstrated Romanesque architecture at its most ambitious. 5 naves, multiple transepts, towers rising at crossings, a forest of stone, and though most of it was destroyed, torn down during Revolution, what remains, a single transept arm, shows the scale, the ambition, the devotion carved into stone. But Romanesque was not static. It was searching, and in the Ile-de-France, in the 12th century, something shifted. Someone, perhaps Abosugger at Saint-Denis, perhaps a master mason whose name is lost, discovered that if you pointed the arch, if you used ribs to carry the weight of vaults, if you moved the support to external buttresses, you could open walls, could fill them with glass, could make stone soar. Gothic architecture was born, and it spread like revelation, like fire, transforming every major city in Europe. Cathedrals rising, reaching, striving upward, the pointed arch, the flying buttress, the ribbed vault, all working together to create spaces that denied their own weight, that seemed to aspire to heaven, Chartres, with its labyrinth, its rose windows, its hundreds of sculptures, its stained glass windows glowing like captured light, telling stories in colored glass. The entire building a Bible for those who could not read, every surface teaching, every space guiding the soul upward. Notre Dame de Paris, its facade a study in proportion, its towers, its rose window, its gallery of kings, and inside the forest of columns, the vaults floating overhead, the light filtering through glass, blue and red and gold, transforming the interior into something otherworldly, something that felt like stepping into prayer itself, and Sainte-Chapelle, that jewel box of glass, where walls almost disappeared, where stone became merely the framework for color, for light, where standing inside felt like standing inside a reliquary, inside sacred radiance, the architecture dissolving into pure luminosity, the Gothic spirit spread across Europe, each region adapting, adding its own accent to the vertical language. In England, the cathedrals grew longer, more horizontal, the perpendicular style emerging with its emphasis on vertical lines in windows and paneling, fan vaults blooming overhead like stone flowers. King's College Chapel at Cambridge, where the vaults seem impossibly delicate, impossibly complex, geometric patterns repeating, intersecting, creating lace from limestone. In Germany, hall churches emerged, where the nave and aisles reached the same height, creating vast unified spaces, no clear story, light entering equally from all sides, a different kind of sacred geometry, a different relationship between worshiper and divine. But even as Gothic reached its zenith, even as spires climbed higher and walls became thinner, something else was stirring in Italy, where Roman ruins still stood, where ancient texts were being rediscovered, where merchants and bankers were accumulating wealth. A new vision was taking form. The Renaissance, that rebirth of classical ideals, began not with a building but with a competition. In 1401, the city of Florence announced a competition to design doors for the baptistery, and artists came, bringing drawings, bringing ambition, and though Lorenzo Ghiberti won, the competition itself announced that a new age had begun, an age where architects would be known, celebrated, where design itself became an art equal to sculpture and painting. Filippo Brunelleschi, goldsmith turned architect, studied the Pantheon, measured Roman ruins, and returned to Florence with a solution to a problem that had vexed the city for decades: how to dome the cathedral, the crossing of Santa Maria del Fiore, 45 meters wide, too wide for wooden centering, too wide for traditional methods. Brunelleschi proposed a dome within a dome, an inner shell and outer shell, linked by ribs, built without scaffolding, using a herringbone brick pattern that allowed the dome to support itself as it rose. And between 1420 and 1436, the dome climbed, and Florence watched as the impossible became real, as mathematics and innovation lifted brick and stone into the sky. The dome changed everything. It announced that the ancients could be equaled, even surpassed, that modern minds could solve ancient problems. And Brunelleschi himself, in buildings like the Pazzi Chapel and San Lorenzo, began to work with classical elements, columns and pilasters, round arches and coffered ceilings, but arranged with new clarity, new proportion, new understanding of space as something to be shaped, controlled, perfected. Leon Battista Alberti Ciucup, architect and theorist, wrote treatises, codified principles, argued that beauty arose from harmony, from the relationship of parts to whole, and in buildings like Sant'Andrea in Mantua, he showed how Roman temple fronts could be adapted to church facades, how the triumphal arch could become a nave elevation, classical language reborn, reimagined. The Renaissance spread from Florence to Rome, where Donato Bramante designed the Tempietto, a small circular temple marking the site of St. Peter's martyrdom, perfect in its proportions, its Doric columns supporting a drum and dome, a miniature building that contained within it an entire philosophy of architecture that proclaimed the ancients had not been surpassed, but understood, honored, continued. And then the great project, the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, which would consume more than a century, which would see design after design, architect after architect. Bramante began it, envisioning a Greek cross plan under a massive dome, but Bramante died, and others came, Raphael, Antonio da Sangallo, each adjusting, revising, expanding, until Michelangelo, already an old man, already the creator of the Sistine ceiling and the David, took control, simplified the plan, strengthened the piers, disturbed, and designed a dome, inspired by Brunelleschi, inspired by the Pantheon, but wholly his own, a double-shell dome rising 136 meters above the floor, visible from across Rome, dominating the skyline, announcing the power and glory of the church, renewed. Andrea Palladio, working in the Veneto region, in Vicenza and Venice and the surrounding countryside, created villas. Villa Rotonda, perfectly symmetrical, a square plan with projecting porticos on all four sides, topped with a central dome, rooms arranged with mathematical precision, windows aligned, proportions derived from musical ratios, the building itself a theorem in stone, proof that beauty and order were one. Palladio wrote his own treatise, I Quattro Libri dell'Architettura, the 4 books on architecture, published in 1570, and these books were translated, were studied, and Palladio's influence spread across Europe, across the Atlantic, his principles shaping buildings for centuries to come, his villas inspiring plantation houses and government buildings, his temple fronts gracing banks and museums, classical ideals filtered through one man's genius, but the Renaissance ideal, that perfect balance, that serene confidence, could not hold forever. And even as Palladio was building his villas, something more theatrical, more emotional, more dramatic was emerging, the Baroque architecture that moved, that swelled and curved, that broke rules even as it honored them. In Rome, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, sculptor and architect, designed the piazza in front of St. Peter's, 2 sweeping colonnades reaching out like arms, embracing, welcoming, creating an oval space that drew pilgrims in, that staged their approach to the church. Architecture as choreography, as performance, inside, Bernini's baldacchino, that massive bronze canopy over the papal altar, twisted columns rising, angels perching, bronze taken from the Pantheon's roof, transformed into something unprecedented, something that combined architecture and sculpture so completely that neither word alone sufficed. Francesco Borromini, Bernini's rival, created churches where walls undulated, where geometry became fluid. San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane, where an oval dome sits atop an oval plan, where coffers diminish in size as they rise, creating forced perspective, making the small church feel vast, where every surface moves, every line curves, rejecting the straight and simple in favor of the complex and alive. The Baroque spread to Austria, where monasteries like Melk rose above the Danube, golden and white, elaborate and exuberant, to Bavaria, where churches became theaters of faith, stucco and gilding and frescoed ceilings that opened to painted heavens, to Spain and Portugal and the New World, where chirigueresque ornament covered every surface, where gold leaf caught candlelight, where architecture became ecstatic. But tastes change, and by the 18th century a reaction was setting in. The Rococo, lighter, more playful than Baroque, gave way to neoclassicism, a return to simpler forms, to Greek and Roman precedents studied with new archaeological rigor. The discoveries at Pompeii and Herculaneum, cities buried by Vesuvius, preserved under volcanic ash, suddenly made ancient Roman domestic architecture visible, real, and architects traveled to see, to draw, to measure, and returned with sketchbooks full of details, of proportions, of ornament. Robert Adam in Britain, Carl Friedrich Schinkel in Prussia, Jacques Germain, Soufflot in France, all worked in this neoclassical mode, creating buildings that looked back to antiquity but served modern needs, museums and libraries, government buildings and country houses, banks and theaters, all dressed in columns and pediments, all speaking the language of Greece and Rome. The Altes Museum in Berlin, Schinkel's masterpiece, a long colonnade of Ionic columns, a rotunda inside echoing the Pantheon, galleries arranged with precision, natural light flooding in, architecture that honored the past while creating spaces for a new kind of cultural institution. And then iron arrived, cast iron, wrought iron, steel, materials that changed everything, that made possible spans and heights that stone could never achieve, that lightened architecture, made it skeletal, made it transparent. The Crystal Palace, Joseph Paxton's design for the Great Exhibition of 1851, was not stone at all. It was glass and iron, prefabricated sections assembled on site, creating a building larger than any cathedral, enclosing mature trees, flooding with light, and though it was meant to be temporary, though it eventually burned, it showed what the new materials could do, showed that architecture could be assembled, could be light, could be modern. Railroad stations became the new cathedrals. Vast sheds of iron and glass, St. Pancras in London, Grand Central in New York, these were spaces of movement, of arrival and departure, their iron ribs supporting glass roofs that sheltered thousands, that created new kinds of public space, secular but somehow still sacred, thresholds between home and elsewhere. The Eiffel Tower, completed in 1889 for the Paris Exposition, was initially controversial. Artists and intellectuals protested, called it an eyesore, but Gustave Eiffel's Tower of Wrought Iron, 300 meters tall, demonstrated the possibilities of the new age, showed that engineering could create beauty, that mathematics and material science could produce wonder. And as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, as electric lights replaced gas, as elevators made height practical, as steel frames replaced load-bearing walls, architecture entered a new era, an era where almost anything seemed possible. Louis Sullivan in Chicago, designing office buildings, created the dictum "form follows function." argued that a building's appearance should reflect its purpose, and his buildings, the Wainwright Building, the Guarantee Building, rose in vertical strips, terracotta ornament wrapping steel frames, the aesthetic of the skyscraper being born. Frank Lloyd Wright. Sullivan's student went further, argued for organic architecture, buildings that grew from their sites, that belonged to their landscapes, falling water, that house cantilevered over a waterfall, stone and concrete and glass merged with forest and stream, horizontal planes floating, space flowing from inside to outside, nature and architecture woven together. In Europe, new movements emerged. Art Nouveau, with its flowing organic lines, its iron-shaped like plants, its rejection of historical styles in favor of a nature-inspired ornament. Antoni Gaudí in Barcelona, creating buildings that seemed to grow, to breathe. The Sagrada Familia, still unfinished, still rising, columns branching like trees, facades carved with biblical scenes and organic forms. Gothic impulse filtered through new vision, and then the modern movement, Le Corbusier, declaring that houses were machines for living, that ornament was crime, that architecture should be pure, functional, rational. His Villa Savoy, raised on pilotis, those slender columns that lifted the building above the ground, ribbon windows wrapping the facade, roof garden on top, the 5 points of architecture made manifest, the Bauhaus in Germany, Walter Gropius bringing together artists and craftspeople and architects, teaching that design should be total, that there should be no distinction between fine art and applied art, that the machine age demanded new aesthetics. And though the Nazis closed the Bauhaus, its teachers scattered to America, to Britain, to Palestine, carrying modernism with them, spreading it globally. Mies van der Rohe, Bauhaus director, architect of pavilions and towers, reduced architecture to its essence. Less is more. God is in the details. The Barcelona Pavilion, marble and chrome and glass, space flowing, planes extending, minimal but perfect. The Seagram Building in New York, bronze and glass tower, set back from the street, creating a plaza, a gesture of generosity in the dense city, its curtain wall expressing the steel frame beneath, honest, elegant, pure. The international style, as it came to be called, spread across the globe after the Second World War, glass boxes rising in every major city, from Sao Paulo to Singapore, from Lagos to Los Angeles, a universal language of steel and glass, of right angles and flat roofs, of curtain walls and open plans. But universality came with questions, with losses, with the erasure of local traditions, regional identities. And by the 1960s, architects were beginning to question, to push back, to argue that modernism's purity had become sterile, that its rationality had forgotten joy, ornament, meaning. Robert Venturi wrote, learning from Las Vegas, studied the commercial strip, the signs and symbols, argued for complexity and contradiction, for an architecture that embraced the ordinary, the vernacular, the decorated shed, and postmodernism emerged, playful, ironic, mixing historical references with modern techniques. Philip Johnson's AT&T building, now the Sony Tower, with its Chippendale pediment, a classical gesture atop a glass skyscraper, architecture winking at itself, Michael Graves painting buildings in pastels, adding columns and keystones that supported nothing, purely decorative, purely communicative. The Portland building, controversial, beloved and hated in equal measure, but undeniably different from the glass boxes surrounding it. James Stirling, combining industrial materials with historical references, the Neue Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart, a rotunda echoing the Alte Museum, but fragmented, layered, brightly colored, stone and steel and glass in conversation, architecture as collage. And then the digital revolution arrived. Computers changing not just how buildings were designed, but what could be designed, what could be built. Suddenly curves were as easy as straight lines, complexity no more expensive than simplicity, and architecture exploded into new forms. Frank Gehry, with Guggenheim Bilbao, completed in 1997, titanium panels rippling like fabric, like water, creating a building that seemed to move, seemed alive. The forms possible only because of computer modeling, because of software developed for aerospace. The building itself became sculpture, became event, became destination, transforming a declining industrial city into a cultural pilgrimage site. Zaha Hadid, painting speed and flow, her building's curves and vectors, the Heydar Aliyev Center in Baku, white concrete flowing, no corners, no seams, continuous surface folding from ground to roof to wall, parametric design made physical, mathematics made poetry. Norman Foster, Santiago Calatrava, Rem Koolhaas, each pushing in different directions. Foster's high-tech precision, glass domes and exposed structure, sustainable systems integrated into design, the Reichstag Dome in Berlin. Transparency as political statement, visitors walking above their representatives, democracy made architectural, Calatrava's structural expressionism, buildings that looked like bones, like wings, like living organisms, the Milwaukee Art Museum, its brise soleil opening and closing like a bird, functional sculpture, engineering as art, Koolhaas's conceptual provocations, CCTV headquarters in Beijing, a loop of building, defying the vertical tower, creating a three-dimensional experience, questioning what a skyscraper should be, what it could be. Sustainability became imperative. Green roofs and solar panels, passive cooling and natural ventilations, Renzo Piano's California Academy of Sciences, its living roof planted with native species, its spherical rain forest and planetarium nestled beneath, architecture reconciling with ecology, with responsibility. And through all these changes, through all these movements and counter-movements, certain questions remained constant. How does space shape experience? How does light transform mood? How does scale affect emotion? How do materials speak? How does architecture hold memory, carry meaning, create identity? Because architecture is never just shelter, never just function. It is the stage on which life unfolds, the frame through which we see, the container of memory and aspiration. Every threshold crossed is a transition. Every room entered is a world. Every window opened is a perspective. And buildings, whether raised from mud brick 10,000 years ago or assembled from parametric algorithms today, serve the same fundamental purpose. They give form to human intention. They make thought visible. They transform imagination into inhabitable reality. The circles of Göbekli Tepe, those first arrangements of carved stone, already understood this, already knew that space shaped experience. That arrangement created meaning, and every innovation since, every arch and dome and vault, every column and buttress and beam, every material and technique and technology has been elaboration on that first insight, refinement of that first understanding, the pyramids reaching toward eternity, the Parthenon perfecting proportion, the Pantheon floating its dome on light, the cathedrals dissolving walls into glass, the iron sheds spanning impossible distance, the steel frames lifting cities skyward, the parametric curves flowing like water frozen. All of these are answers to the same question. What can we make space do? What can we make it mean? How can we shape the world to reflect, to amplify, to elevate human experience? And now, in our current moment, buildings like the Sphere in Las Vegas, completed in 2023, bring us full circle. 16,000 square meters of LED screen wrapping a spherical exoskeleton, creating an interior volume where up to 20,000 people can gather, where images can surround, where sound can envelop, where technology and architecture merge to create experiences impossible anywhere else. Inside, the largest LED screen ever built wraps the interior. 16,000 by 16,000 pixels of resolution, capable of displaying anything, everything, transporting audiences to other worlds, other realities, and outside, the exosphere, glowing, changing, visible from orbit, a new kind of landmark, a new kind of monument, not to gods or kings or ideals, but to experience itself, to wonder, to the human capacity to imagine and then build the imagined, from carved pillars under open sky to pixel-wrapped domes of light, from the stone circles to spherical screens. The thread runs unbroken, the conversation continues, and what becomes clear across all these millennia, across all these cultures and styles and innovations, is that architecture is fundamentally optimistic. It is always an act of faith, faith that the future will come, that people will inhabit these spaces, that meaning will accumulate, that stone or brick or steel or pixels will serve purposes we cannot fully predict. Every building is a gift to the future, a message in a bottle sent forward through time. And some of these messages endure for centuries, for millennia, while others last mere decades before transformation or demolition, but all of them, in their moment, represented someone's vision of what could be, what should be, how the world might be shaped to better hold human life. The architects whose names we remember, Imhotep and Ictinus, Brunelleschi and Michelangelo, Paxton and Sullivan, Corbusier and Mies, Gehry and Hadid, are remembered because their visions changed what was possible, opened new paths, created new languages, but they were always building on foundations laid by others, always in conversation with the past, even as they reached toward the future, and the unnamed builders, the masons and carpenters, the engineers and craftspeople, the thousands upon thousands whose hands actually raised the stones, mixed the mortar, carved the details, fitted the joints. They too are part of this story, their skill and labor, making vision real, making drawings three-dimensional, making imagination inhabitable. Architecture connects us to the past through the buildings we inherit, to the future through the buildings we create, to each other through the spaces we share, and walking through a city, any city, is walking through layers of time, through accumulated decisions and dreams, through the physical manifestation of changing values and technologies and aspirations, a Roman column reused in a medieval church, a Gothic arch reinterpreted in a Victorian building, a modernist grid echoed in a contemporary tower. Architecture is always in dialogue with itself, always quoting, referencing, responding, the built environment a kind of three-dimensional text, readable by those who know its vocabulary, its grammar, its history, and standing before any building, from the simplest shelter to the most complex structure, we can ask, what problem was this solving? What vision was this expressing? What technologies made this possible? What traditions informed this? What innovations did this introduce? And in answering these questions, in reading buildings this way, we connect to the makers, understand something of their world, their constraints and possibilities, their hopes and fears. The moon rises over cities old and new, illuminating stone temples and glass towers. And in that light, in that ancient light that witnessed the first shelters, the first walls, the first architecture, everything connects. Gobekli Tepe and the sphere, mud brick and pixel, carved stone and parametric curve, all part of one continuous story, the story of how humans shape space and are shaped by it in return. The conversation continues in every city where cranes rise, in every studio where architects draw, in every place where vision meets material, where imagination becomes real, and the thread extends forward into futures we cannot see, toward buildings we cannot yet imagine, continuing the ancient dialogue between human aspiration and physical reality, between dream and stone, between thought and space. Night deepens, and buildings stand in darkness, waiting for dawn, for the light that will reveal their forms again, their shadows, their presence in the world. And somewhere, always, someone is drawing, planning, imagining the next structure, the next space, the next answer to the eternal question of how we should shape the world we inhabit. The wind moves through stone circles, through cathedral naves, through steel canyons, through geodesic domes, carrying with it the whisper of all the spaces that came before, all the hands that built, all the minds that conceived. And the earth turns, and buildings endure or fall, transform or persist, but the impulse remains constant, human, essential, to make, to build, to shape space into meaning, to create from imagination and material something that holds life, that frames existence, that gives a physical form to our endless conversation with time and place and each other,